we are defined by our history. Like if you were to wake up tomorrow and not remember anything, that wouldn't just be your memory was gone, but your identity would be gone. So the history is who you are.
How do you even begin to write a history of the world?
Basically what this was my own classroom experience turned into written form. I realized very early on that stories resonate with kids and it sticks with them. And so when you told me your vision for this, I was like, this really resonates with how I teach. This is the story of the human family, of the Catholic family. The church has always been on the verge of destruction.
Yeah.
I thought like, wow, it was really hard for the church in the Roman Empire. They almost got, then I was like, but then it became legalized. But then actually it almost got destroyed by these heresies. And then actually Islam almost, and then actually the Vikings almost, and then actually that's literally how it's always been. And you see the crisis in the moment and the continuity is more visible in retrospect. It's always been Peter standing on the waves saying, "Save me, Lord, I'm sinking." Like, it's always been that. Yeah.
10 years ago, man. Story of Civilization was launched, and it's been a hell of a ride since then. So we are here today with Phillip Campbell, and I got my brother Kevin, who's usually behind the camera. But given Kevin's prominent role in the Story of Civilization series and Story of Mary series, doing the audio drama. Did you do an audio of Mary?
Yeah, we did audio dramas for each of them, yeah.
Yeah, so Kevin was the voice behind it. And because so many people think his voice is you as you travel around the country.
Everywhere I go, it's the most prominent compliment I get is I love hearing you read Story of Civilization, and I'm so I want to take credit for it. It's just kind of ironic that
nobody needs to know who
it's
I am.
his voice.
You should do it.
I'm like, I'm sorry, that's a voice actor, but
well, our listeners know what a significant series this was in their homeschooling world, and many young kids, well, now many adults who were kids listening to this might be hearing this episode, remembering 10 years ago, starting to learn history from you. But anyway, Phillip Campbell is a well-respected historian, a real literature expert in many ways. He's written many books for TAN. I got most of them here. Heroes and Heretics, which is about the Counter-Reformation. That's not here, but I just couldn't find it for some reason, but it's one of my favorites. But anyway, you've done so much work for us. It's been extremely successful, particularly the history curriculum. So we're very honored to welcome you to this table.
I'm very honored to be here and see you guys again and reflect on this. I can't believe it's been 10 years.
It's crazy. Yeah. So, I was trying to remember how we first got in touch with you. And I think it was Maureen.
Through Maureen, yeah.
Yeah, Homeschool Connections, which I think many people probably know about.
Yeah.
And I was talking to her, and she
dropped my name.
She dropped your name. And then we called, and I knew that I need to. Here's what I remember how we got started into this whole thing. Well, it starts, I got to give my wife credit. It starts with Ashley, because we had been doing Story of the World. With our kids. It's a non-denominational Protestant history curriculum, and it's in many respects it was a wonderful creation. They had a great audio book. It wasn't an audio drama. It was just like an audio book.
Yeah.
But it made history so fun, and it would like insert, it would go into, I don't know what you call it, not first person, but it would go in res, like it would go into the story and start telling a little piece of the Odyssey or the Iliad or the Aeneid or whatever part of Gilgamesh. It would tell a little piece of Gilgamesh or whatever. And my oldest kids, who are now like 23 and 21, they were, as young guys, they were listening to the audio book of Story of the World. And my wife, she's like, Connor, you run a Catholic publishing company. What are you doing? Go make a Catholic version of Story of the World. Go do it. I'm like, okay. So we eventually did, and I was talking to Maureen. I was like, we need to make a Catholic version of Story of the World. And she's like, I got your guy. So I got your name, and I remember where I was. It's funny because we happened to be at a beach retreat. We were at, I don't remember what beach, but our company goes on annual trips. But we were at a beach this particular year, and I had with me like an epic novel book that you wrote.
Oh, yeah.
What was that
Tale
called?
of Meneth.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I remember just buying that and kind of skimming through it to get a sense of what kind of writer you were.
Yeah.
And I saw, okay, this guy is not just like a historian. He's taught history with Homeschool Connection. He's a storyteller.
Yeah.
He's a storyteller. And I knew that's what we needed. So we came out with the plan to do a 4-part volume of, the world. And we called it Story of Civilization.
Yeah.
And that's how we got started.
Yeah. And I remember talking about remembering exactly where I was at the time. I was mayor of Howell, Michigan.
This is awesome.
Yeah, I was in local politics, and I was working also. I had an office job for a pest control company. I was teaching for Maureen on the side, but my main gig was like working in this office. And Kevin contacted me, or not Kevin, you did. You contacted me out of the blue and asked to talk to me on the phone. And I was at the office. I was at the pest control job, and I remember I walked outside, and I wasn't prepared because when I got on the phone, it was like you and Rick Rotondi was on the phone, and all these this huge like conference call, and I was like, oh shoot, like I didn't think it was going to be this. And you pitched the whole idea to me, and I didn't know what Story of the World even was.
I remember.
You were kind of explaining it to me. It took me a while to understand the format. As I recall, you had to send me copies of the books in the mail, and I went through them. And I quickly understood why you wanted a Catholic version, because as exciting as those books are, they did not handle the Catholic elements of European history very well. And after we put it all together and started on the track of producing Civilization, I started to realize that not only could we make a Catholic version of this, but we could actually improve upon the quality of what was done with the audio dramas, like actually dramatizing the stories, but also with the focus of the content. Story of the World is very, very spread out about world history, and you get a very surface view of a lot of things, where I said, no, we can go in a lot of depth and narrow the scope and just focus on Western Civ and get some really good stuff. And it just came together. It was one of those like lightning in a bottle sort of things. We were all there at the right time with the right idea.
Yeah.
And, that ended up being so successful. I resigned from being mayor to like the last 6 months into my term. And I gave this as the official reason. I was like, I'm focusing on my writing this book series.
Well, good.
And it was a nice feel. Now, really, I wanted to get out because the politics were so toxic.
Well, you're welcome for providing an excuse.
You gave me a great feel-good excuse where you'd be like, oh, good for the mayor. He's going to go write history books. And I could just ride off into the sunset. So that was nice.
You're like, I need to go down to Kevin Gallagher's house and record chapter review videos for my new history curriculum.
Yes, that's exactly the excuse I gave.
I think it's actually kind of funny that you were mayor, because like after getting to know you, like as early as you came down and we met you, and I'm sorry, but like you just don't come across as the mayor type. No. It's like totally normal. Like there's not 1 ounce of you that seems politician-ish.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. You're not artificial.
Not at all. And like actually you told me the story of how you got elected.
Yeah.
And it had something, you have to remember, it had something to do with some stupid speed bump things they had or
Yeah, the city had installed. You guys know roundabouts.
Roundabouts. Yeah.
So they had installed miniature roundabouts at all these intersections of the city called mini circles, which looked like roundabouts, but they were not functional. So you were still supposed to treat it like a 4-way stop, but it looked like a roundabout, and it was like ridiculously confusing, and everybody hated them. And I realized how unpopular they were, and I just kind of thought, I bet if I ran on a platform of I hate the mini circles that I will get elected, and I did.
See, that's what I mean. I mean, it's just so normal. Which, if all politicians were that authentic, the world would be better.
The most practical reason to get into politics ever.
Just because I hated something. Yeah,
that's a great reason to be going to politics.
And here's how stupid politics is: 4 years in office. There was 20 mini circles. I succeeded in removing 3 of them. The rest are still there to this day.
That's like one every 15 months or something like that.
Yeah. There was so much bureaucracy and stuff. It was like, okay, I got 3 of them out.
15%.
What else did you accomplish as mayor?
Oh, not much. I learned a lot about how water flows and where it goes. And I did a lot of stuff that's not very glamorous. I did a lot of things like, approving projects for renovations of recreational areas and taking care of the roads, and like, oh, I put that new sidewalk on Walnut Street. Like nothing that's worth putting on a resume or anything. It's just the nitty gritty of administering a city. But I will tell you, and I'm being sincere about it. I learned so much. When I got into office, there was almost like a moment where it was like, oh shoot, I won. Like I wasn't sure if I was going to win, but I put all of it into it. And then there was the moment where like, hey bud, like you're in charge now. It's your ship. And I was, thank God, like I was kind of had the presence of mind to realize that I didn't know anything. I mean, you know this from running an organization. Yep. You come into an organization from the outside and like you don't know anything about the internal dynamics of that or how it works. And I was cognizant enough to bring together those people and say, look, I know that you didn't expect me to be here. I didn't expect me to be here. But now that I am here, I need your help to understand how this works. And they welcomed me, and we're able to have a good working relationship, And so I realized that coming into that leadership position, I needed to learn as much as I needed to command. And I felt like I struck a really good balance. On my second term, nobody even ran against me. They allowed me to run for a whole second term without opposing me. So that was very nice.
And choosing you to write this series, because I knew it was going to be like pretty much a long-term relationship. I mean, this was not going to be written over 6 months.
Yeah.
So there was a couple things. One, I read your book that, was this epic tale.
Yeah.
I showed you were creative. You were a storyteller. Second, I saw that you were a mayor and you had that kind of executive experience. But then third, found something on YouTube.
Oh my gosh.
So here we go. If you can play this little bit.
No.
So This sealed the deal. I'm like, this is the guy. So
what is this? Oh no.
Oh yeah.
No. Are you going to put a video up too?
Oh yes. Oh yeah. They're going to see it. This is
from 2009?
Yeah, you've lost weight. You're looking good.
Hey there, Obama, I am feeling so much calmer since the Congress had a rule made that we have to drink your Kool-Aid. It's the law.
We have to drink your Kool-Aid. It's the law.
To hold the president.
Did you do this while you were mayor?
No, this was before I was mayor.
This was part of the campaign?
Look at this. Look at how fat my chin was.
Till those federal agents burst in and they shot me with a squirt gun. Now
So I was
I'm like, that's my guy right there. Like, I knew it. When I saw this guy, I'm like, okay, that's the guy to write our history series. What does that say about me?
I was a youth director at a Catholic parish in Ann Arbor when this happened, and this was right after Obama had gotten elected. And a gentleman in the parish who was this guy here. This guy composed this song.
Oh, he did?
Yeah, he composed the lyrics and everything, and he was like, I need like a goofy, charismatic guy to like perform this. So
you ruined it for me. I thought you wrote it. See, I never would have hired you if I had known that. I'm just kidding.
You need to write him a thank you letter.
Yeah.
He gave you your excuse to resign.
Oh man, it's so funny. The lyrics, they're brilliant. They're actually quite brilliant. Yeah.
This guy was like a semi-professional parodyist. That was his thing. Was he'd write parodies. Yeah.
That's good.
That I can't believe. Oh my gosh,
It's
it's
funny.
So when I was having that meeting with you on the phone, and you had the whole board there, and it was all professional, you had this in the back of your mind.
Yeah. Again, what it showed is like, okay, this is a totally.
You played it right after we got off the phone call.
I did, yeah. No, I did, because I was like, okay, no, seriously, I thought you wrote it, but I mean, you're playing the guitar, you're making a video. He's creative.
Yeah.
And I don't need some stuffy, college professor to explain the Renaissance to my fifth grader. What I need is a fun story. Yeah. And I saw somebody who knows how to have fun and somebody who's creative and artistic, and it worked.
It kind of demonstrates, like, you reading the epic book I wrote and then watching this, like, I guess if anybody young is listening to this, like, you never know the creative things that you're doing, how they're going to like compound down the road and help you out in certain ways, because both of those items were just for pure recreation,
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Oh gosh, I can't believe the
internet's there forever, man. It's going to be there forever.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
be proud of it. Own it.
All right.
Well, all right. So that's how we kind of got to know each other. We start writing these things. And then we didn't bring everything here, but it's got workbooks, it's got test books. The whole team had to put a lot of work into it. I mean,
and your wife did a lot on those test books.
Yeah, she did. Yeah, she kind of really helped create a lot of the teacher side of this and arts and crafts for kids and just all kinds of things like that. So
There's a timeline poster.
yeah, no, I
10
wish
years
we
ago
would have brought that in here, but
10 years ago we had DVDs. Now it's digital.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So tell us about like how you started trying to write this sucker, because when you started with the ancient world, volume 1, let's just take that as an example. How did you decide, okay, here's the time frame? How did you start? I mean, did you just go read a whole bunch of other books? I mean, like, how do you even begin to write a history of the world?
Yeah, well, having been teaching history at that time for, I think, 2015, I would have been teaching history for about 8 years at that point. I already knew the big picture, from my education, and it was more of like figuring out what the format was going to be. And basically what this was my own classroom experience turned into like written form. Like in my classes, I used to teach we have a mutual friend in Dr. Henry Russell.
Yes.
I would teach for his co-op, St. Augustine, and I taught there for 10 years. And I used to use this model where I just kind of introduce the facts and then I would tell stories. And I realized very early on that stories resonate with kids.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Like you think about, like, if I were to ask you to recall some like history fact, a lot of people would not be able to recall a history fact. But if I would say, like, narrate to me the plot of the Two Towers or something, they could tell me the entire plot of the story. And it's because they're reading a story, and it sticks with them. And so when you told me your vision for this, I was like, this really resonates with how I teach, So it was pretty straightforward to just put together the chronology and understand. I mean, really, like, this is like I would teach a year of ancient history, then I would teach medieval, then it was the 4-year program that I would basically teach. The tricky part was just finding the right voice for the stories, finding the right voice. And we had a little bit of, here's a little fun Easter egg. If anyone has Story of Civilization, Volume 1, if you go into that book and go to chapter 16, the Persian Wars, the story in chapter 16 was the pilot that got me the job. Because you had asked me for a pilot chapter, and you said I could write on any history thing I wanted. I just had to tell a story and make it fun,
Yeah.
So I wrote on Xerxes and the Battle of Salamis, I think, and that's in chapter 16 of Volume 1. And you liked it so much, we just imported it totally into the chapter.
Yeah.
So it was a matter of finding the voice. And that was the trickiest part. The history, not so much. I already knew the history. It was really the creative side, finding the right, voice to speak to the students in.
If I remember right, when you submitted it the first time, we only iterated once, I think. You were so close. The first draft you submitted was so close to the voice. Now, maybe you had already spent 10 drafts before that.
Yeah.
But I think we only iterated with you one time.
Yeah. I sent one draft in about ancient Egypt or something, and then you guys said this was very close, but you wanted me to lean into the storytelling even further. Mm-hmm. And so then I just straight up wrote like a drama,
Yeah.
And then you were like, that's it.
When you think of yourself, like, if you say I am a blank, do you say historian?
No, because I don't have a PhD and I don't want to upset real historians. I say
you've written more history than most PhDs ever.
Yeah, I refer to myself as a history author, or a history teacher, or a history promoter,
but not a historian. That's silly.
No, I know.
I mean, I get it, but
I'm trying to be respectful of the field. I understand.
Yeah. So, but you spent most of your
adult life
teaching, history.
Yeah, I've forgotten more history than most people have ever, known.
Yeah, you're a historian. Definitely. This is like Joseph Pierce, who has more literary knowledge than the vast majority of PhDs in literature, but he doesn't have that advanced degree.
Yeah.
So there's a prejudice against that, of course.
Yeah, and he came to my house a few months ago.
Did he?
Yeah, I made him steak. It was nice.
Oh,
but
he's a great friend.
Yeah, he was speaking near my hometown. He stayed with me, but we had this conversation, and he was kind of on the same page with me, where he's kind of like, we're cognizant of it, where we don't want to step into the knowledge is one thing, and then like being able to, you don't want to put yourself forward as if you have a credential you don't.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, when we were eating lunch here just a few minutes ago, I learned something about you. I don't remember knowing this. Although after 10 years you start forgetting things.
Mm-hmm.
But you're a convert. Or
Kind-of-ish.
a revert.
Yeah.
Yeah. Significant one. I mean, it's like you didn't practice at all. But tell us a little bit about that and I mean, being a historian, that's okay. A history, whatever you want to call it.
You can say historian.
Yeah, historian. But
We will.
okay. That I'm sure as a very thoughtful, thinking, educated man, history played into this in some way, shape, or form. So,
yeah.
So talk to us about your kind of conversion story.
Yeah, well, I was not raised with any religion. My family, we could say they were like culturally Catholic from being Sicilian, Polish, etc. So I was baptized as a child, but like I never made a first communion. I have no memory of ever going to mass, anything like that. Never went to church as a kid. I got into all sorts of stuff as a teenager, going to a secular high school, all sorts of different ideas and, behaviors and stuff that weren't good. And I eventually entered into like a spiritual crisis my first year of college, which initially I was going to be an artist. I had a generous scholarship to go to the College for Creative Studies in Detroit. And everybody had me pegged as like a future, like a fine artist, because I was a really good illustrator.
Really?
Yeah. And that's what I might have ended up doing. But I had a spiritual crisis my first year in college. Just what we'd call like an existential crisis. What's the meaning of life? What am I doing? Why should I just waste all this time in college, just get a paycheck each week to live this meaningless existence? It's very like existential, and I went into a deep depression. And a good friend of mine from high school, my best friend actually, John, he brought me to Christ during that time. He had kind of been telling me about Jesus over multiple months, and it kind of broke me down, and I had a very sort of emotional conversion, and it really changed my whole. It was very dramatic. I think people who knew me kind of thought I'd joined a cult or something because my behavior was very, very different very quickly, And so I started taking the Bible very, very seriously. Like basically all my spare time. I dropped out of college. I just couldn't handle it. I got a job at a gas station. And then in all my spare time at the gas station and when I wasn't at work, I'd just study the Bible and go to different like worship services and focus on this. I memorized Bible passages, read it. Like I must have read the whole Bible 4 or 5 times,
Wow.
And I had flashcards where I'd memorize the verses. It was like, life-giving. But then and I kind of floated around in the Protestant sort of low church Pentecostal world, like the house church movement.
Mm-hmm.
But then as I was going through that, and this happens to many Protestants, you start to run across people with different interpretations of things. Like I remember amongst my new Christian friends having serious disagreements about whether Christians could smoke cigarettes or not, and things
Yes,
like,
the answer is yes.
The fullness of Catholic truth. Yes.
Listen, Mom.
But at the time, or very important things like what's the role of baptism, and what does the Holy Spirit do? Am I supposed to be speaking in tongues? Like all these things. And I would float around at different churches and they'd have different opinions and nobody could conclusively settle anything. And I eventually started like looking to the history because I'd always been interested in history. And I started studying Christian history to try to understand if there was any like continuity. And I was really shocked to find like how a lot of the different viewpoints that are in the Christian world today, how so many of them are so recent, I mean, from the Reformation, yes, but a lot of them are just from like 1900 or 1840, like in the Protestant milieu that I was kind of moving in, something like the rapture was just taken for granted. Like every group I went to believed in the rapture. And then I was kind of astounded to find that it wasn't really attested before, I think, the 1840s, that it was that recent. And I was like, but what did the early Christians think? And then I started reading the fathers and the history. And usually once you start reading the history, it's kind of all over at that point, if you're Protestant. Right. And I was kind of like mortified at first to find how Catholic it was, because I didn't really consider Catholicism even a viable option as a branch of Christianity. I kind of thought it was just like this completely perverted, kind of watered down, neo-paganism almost, with all the statues and the saints and the mumbo jumbo. And then I started reading, and I was like, oh, they had bishops, they have sacraments, and I started realizing it was Catholic. But everything changed for me when I discovered St. Francis of Assisi. And I will never not talk about St. Francis when I talk about my conversion, because I believe that he brought me to the faith. I found a movie called Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon that actually my Protestant friend showed me. He brought it back from the Jesus people in California and showed it to me. And it was like a very hippie take on St. Francis, made in 1971 by Franco Zeffirelli. Has a soundtrack by Donovan. It's such a hippie movie. But even so, the simplicity and the humility and the beauty of St. Francis' spirituality cut through everything and spoke to me in a very profound way. And I just fell in love with this historical character, and I read everything I could about him. And he was absolutely the most charismatic saint that I'd ever encountered. I didn't even know about saints, really. And I was just whatever this guy has, I want it, And I remember going through a phase where I'd walk around my town barefoot, like St. Francis, just trying to imitate him. And, that brought me into the church, wow. And I entered into the church on his feast day. It was very fortuitous. Wow. See, because I was baptized Catholic as a baby, I didn't need to wait till Easter. All I needed to do was make a confession and make a profession of faith, and I could receive communion. And the priest where I was coming into the church at Holy Spirit in Brighton, Michigan, he said, is there, it was October, and he's like, I can bring you in next Sunday. And I looked on the calendar, and it was St. Francis's feast day. So wow. I was brought in on his day, and I took his name on confirmation, so I will give, the credit to him, and to God, obviously, for bringing me back. But yeah, the history was such a big part. And then after that kind of reoriented where I was in life. When I go into education, I want to teach history to others, because it's not just and what we get at with this series, it's not just these boring facts and dates and whatnot. This is the story of the human family, of the Catholic family. We are defined by our history. I know you're a big cinema guy, like I am. That humanity, there's kind of a trope in cinema where an alien or a robot will want to learn about oh, what is this humanity, Yeah. And what do they always do to learn about humanity in these movies? They have the robot or the alien, they'll have a scene where it's going through human history, it's scrolling, or in the old 80s movie, I think it was a Short Circuit, they have the robot flipping through the encyclopedia,
yeah, Short Circuit, yeah.
Reading the human history. So the history is who you are, if you were to have amnesia and forget your history, you would actually have no identity, right? If you were to wake up tomorrow and not remember anything, that wouldn't just be your memory was gone, but your identity would be gone. So this stuff is all extremely important and life-giving and nourishing. And the history was so important to me. And so this is it's not just a thing I happen to be good at. It's something that was very vital in me forging my own identity as a person, as a Catholic.
Didn't St. Augustine and some other early fathers talk about memory as part of the soul?
Yeah.
They had that was a part of it. It's not, we just think intellect and will. But I think memory was.
Yeah, in Augustine's De Trinitate, he says that memory is memory, will, and intellect.
Yeah.
Right? It's a part of our fundamental identity. Yeah.
Have you been to St. Francis's tomb in Assisi?
I have not.
Oh,
have you?
Yeah. And it's,
they have his habit there, I think.
Awesome.
They do.
Yeah.
And it's maybe it sounds like a little cliche or something because Assisi is such a popular tourist place.
Yeah.
But I think I've been there at least 3 times, maybe 4, I have to think. But his tomb is the most glorious place on the planet. The Garden of Eden is still
small,
hidden.
quaint place, right?
Yes.
Is this where they have the little chapel that's enclosed in the larger basilica?
Yeah, what's in the crypt? It's down in its basement.
Yeah.
And you go down the stone steps beneath the big basilica of St. Francis. And as you go down, it feels like a little catacomb, sort of.
Yeah.
But you go in, it's very small. It's maybe
30 people, maybe?
Yeah.
It's not many.
Maybe. But It's actually like a little roundabout, like those things
Yeah,
you
mini
attacked
circle.
as mini circle. But it's this tiny little mini circle
Yeah.
with his tomb right there in the middle.
Yeah.
And some of his earliest followers are buried down there with him.
Wow.
But
Wow.
there's something, like I've been in a lot of beautiful churches, but this thing takes it's not that it's the most beautiful.
It's just the most compelling.
I think the spirit of St. Francis is there.
It's intimate.
Yeah.
And you meet a lot of people who have quasi-mystical experiences there, and I know some.
Yeah.
Children, adults,
Yeah.
who come out of that. Like when you go in there and you pray, like time kind of stops. Like I've been in there a couple times where I thought I was in there for 10, 15 minutes, and it was an hour and a half.
Wow. Wow.
There's something very special there. And my first son, his middle name is Francis.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, it's
I just love him so much.
Yeah, and that's so good. And he's been trivialized, by modernity.
Yeah.
And
He's like a garden statue.
yeah, and he's a poster boy for the left.
Yeah.
And I don't get it.
Yeah.
I mean,
They don't know his whole story.
they don't know the
Just see
whole
the
story.
animals, the birds and the rabbits. And
In fact, I have I'm not the historian. Maybe I need to consult you on this more after the show. But one of my recent goals is to write a more popular narrative biography of like I guess what you call it, an inspirational biography, not a scholarly work, but an inspirational biography on Bernard of Clairvaux.
Oh yeah.
And he's just spectacular. Who
He's
you write
so
about?
great.
You
Yeah.
write about,
Yeah.
volume 2 or 3?
Yeah, two. And in Story of the Church.
Yeah. Oh, we're missing that one. That's
we?
the one we're missing.
Oh, so we're
Forgot
missing two books.
Yeah, we are.
too, yeah.
But my point is that I've read, Tan publishes a heavy hitter Bernard of Clairvaux biography. I think he's one of the most spectacular saints in the whole history of the church.
I agree.
But he doesn't get the press that he deserves. In fact, the far left has kind of hijacked him as well.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know about this.
The Cistercians really went far left. But it's interesting. The left can use Bernard in this mystical theology sense to where it's like very anti-rational. Like, so, Bernard.
Like anti-dogmatic.
Yes.
Yeah.
But the left also hates him in a certain way because he helped lead the Crusades.
I was going to say
they saw him as a bloodthirsty jerk.
He even wrote the rule for the Templars, I think.
He did.
Yeah.
He did. He did so much stuff. But when you're trying to be anti-Thomistic, and he had a battle in his life with Peter Abelard, who was a rationalist, right? Who wanted to boil the faith down into like the tax code. It was just like a set of
into logical propositions.
Yes, logical propositions. And he took him on. And so if you want to attack what you perceive as rationalism, you rely on Bernard. But if you also want to attack, a more militant side of things, you use Bernard. So it's just
such a dumb dichotomy because it's
is.
not as if Bernard was anti-rationalist. He was excessive rationalism, which, a lot of those philosophers that age enamored with the new philosophy were under the impression that the faith could be boiled down to basically that it was completely exchangeable with philosophy.
Yeah.
And Bernard wants to preserve the revelatory aspect of it, the mystical aspect of it, without denying the rationalism of it. But it's such a dumb.
It's a dumb dichotomy.
It's a dumb dichotomy.
But I think this has resulted in like the more recent in the church history, last couple hundred years, focus on Thomism.
Yeah.
They've kind of pushed Bernard to the side, which I got beef with, because if you're traditional Catholic, you tend to focus on scholastic, systematic theology, and mystical theology kind of loses its appeal, which I have a problem with. Like, the reason I brought that up, though, Philip, is that I want to write this biography on him because I think he's just missed. So I decided recently, and I just found it. I had my son go to my parents' house and find my old stash of books, which is still there because I have so many books I can't keep them all. But I said, go find St. Francis's biography by G.K. Chesterton because I want to read that again to see how did he handle it?
Yeah,
how did he handle it? How did he write a biography? Both the Dumb Ox and St. Francis. I said get both because they're not like scholarly works.
No.
But I want to read those now, especially the St. Francis one, in light of how do you have this kind of literary, inspirational biography that really distills down. Like, I want to imagine, what if G.K. Chesterton wrote a biography like that on Bernard of Clairvaux?
Yeah.
That's what I want to do. Not that
Yeah.
I can write like Chesterton. I'm just saying that's the goal.
That's the style.
That's
yeah.
the style. And so I'm just about to read the biography of St. Francis. In fact, we just finished up Lent when we're recording this. And I gave up for Lent reading anything but the Bible.
Oh.
It was really, really, really hard. So I've actually had the St. Francis biography just kind of sitting there ready to go. So I'm going to start it soon.
That's cool.
But Bernard, since I'm talking to a historian, I just want to go on that for a second. But Bernard, you know, he was so popular in the Middle Ages that Dante put him in the final stages of Paradiso.
Yeah.
You know, Beatrice everyone thinks that she led him through paradise, and she did, but she has to fall off, and Bernard takes over. That shows
The esteem.
the esteem.
Yeah.
And we don't pay attention to him anymore.
And Tan publishes. You have this great collection of sermons by like Alphonsus Liguori or
Yes.
these great 17th century saints. And if you read their homilies, they like are referring to Bernard constantly.
You're right. You're so right.
Yeah.
It's so evident, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an amazing. We could talk about Bernard for hours, but it's just an amazing guy, you know. So I'm so glad to see Francis is near and dear to you. It really is to me too. What's that?
What was the story that made it in for Bernard of Clairvaux with the sound? Was it the swarm of flies?
The swarm of flies.
Yeah.
Yeah. Excommunicating the flies.
He did.
Yeah.
He did. Yeah. Have you heard about the shoulder devotion?
To Bernard's shoulder?
No, Bernard came up with a devotion to the shoulder of Christ. Have you heard about this?
Vaguely.
Okay, so it's kind of picking up steam.
Yeah.
And it's fun. This is just amazing. Like you learn something and then you see it everywhere. You know how that happens?
Yeah.
Well, I had heard about this just recently, and then we were with Bishop Strickland not too long ago.
Yeah.
And he had just heard about it. And so he brought it up. I'm like, I swear I just learned this. But Bernard, being an incredible mystic, he had a mystical vision of Christ, and he asked Christ what was the most painful wound that you had in your passion, and expecting him to say hands or feet or something, but he said my shoulder, when the cross is digging into my shoulder as I'm carrying it, you know.
Yeah.
And so he wrote a devotion to the shoulder wound of Christ, and then fast forward, Padre Pio, which by the way,
Oh yeah, we have a book on that.
you wrote a book, Wounds of Love, on the story of Padre Pio.
Yeah.
But there's a part, allegedly, Padre Pio, when he was asked, I heard this, I hope it's true, a young John Paul II, a young Karol Wojtyła, went to visit Padre Pio and asked him, had the gall to ask him, hey, what's the most painful part of your stigmata?
Yeah.
And he said, it's actually my shoulder wound. And Carol was like, what? You know? And he explained it. And then after Padre Pio died, the people that gathered his garments and stuff found blood all over his shoulders. All of his clothes had blood on his shoulder.
Wow.
So it's just, you know, if it's not true, I hope it is. It should be.
That's a cool
It's
story.
such a great story. And I should probably do the research and find out if it's really true, because I keep talking about it. But that's another really cool little thing about Bernard, is the shoulder wound we get from him.
So you see how just in this little conversation we've kind of woven together Francis, Bernard, John Paul II, Padre Pio, Dante, Chesterton. Yeah, like I was saying, this history like kind of ties everything.
It does.
Everything together.
Yeah, it does. It does. So what was it like, Kevin, making the audio dramas? I mean, that was a ton of work.
Well, I told Philip multiple times over the years, his writing made it the easiest job ever, and it's probably the most enjoyable thing I've done in my job with Tan for 15 years now. The thing I've enjoyed the most, top to bottom. It was a lot of work, a lot of time, because I didn't just do the voice; I did the music and sound effects and everything too. But the fun thing I've told Philip a couple times now is, some of his stories would have specific references to specific pieces of traditional music, and not really realizing that was going to send me off on a rabbit hole to try to find a recording of that we could actually use. And my favorite, there was a couple. There was the coronation of Napoleon, I think if I'm even saying that correctly, from Volume 3. There was a very popular traditional hymn, but there was a specific arrangement of it that you actually called out in the text.
And so that like tied you to having to put that song
and I had to go get the one that you referenced, not just the one that was really popular that I could have found easily. I had to go get the hard one.
Whoops.
And then the song at the scaffold, which I love this one because the nuns of Compiègne. I forget how to pronounce it now. I'm when I read the book and I can't pronounce it. But they were singing the Veni Creator Spiritus as they were being marched to the gallows. And guillotine, exactly. Yeah. And so I had to find a recording of that, and I found these nuns in L.A. actually, Carmelite Sisters of the Sacred Heart in L.A., and they had beautiful recordings, which I've got here actually.
Hey, before you play it,
Yeah.
can you tell the audience real quick the story of Song of the Scaffold? Because just most people probably don't know that story.
Yeah, so this was during the reign of terror of the French Revolution, when the revolutionary government had been taken over by Robespierre. And basically, this was the height of the persecution of the church and the anti-clericalism of the church. They had passed the civil constitution of the clergy, which had essentially transferred the authority of the church over to the secular state. But obviously, there was people who refused to bow to this. And there was just persecution of traditional religious life. So religious orders were considered enemies of the state because of their devotion to the church and the papacy.
What do they call it? Constitution of the clergy or something like that?
Yeah, the civil constitution of the clergy.
And if you didn't sign to say that you take your first allegiance to the state, I think that's what they said. You have to take your first allegiance to the state. I think if you were a nun, you got your head cut off.
Yeah.
And if you were a priest, you got drowned.
Yeah.
I think that's how
Awful.
they did it. Yeah.
Yeah, so the martyrs of Compiègne were a group of Carmelites who were, the entire convent was sent to the guillotine. And it's a very moving...
Can you imagine, like Trade and Tryon downtown Charlotte, big city. Can you imagine there being such a revolt, such a situation where they go and they pull Poor Clare nuns from out of the cloister and march them down Trade and Tryon, like that, right downtown Charlotte,
and chop their head off in public.
And chop their head off in public. Like, I think people miss the fact that the French Revolution,
how evil.
It was pure evil.
Yeah, I've thought about this. I was just talking about this with one of my students, where during the French Revolution, they dragged out the few relics of Joan of Arc that still existed and destroyed them. And I was just thinking to myself, like, how awful do you have to be as a Frenchman to drag out the relics of Joan of Arc and destroy them?
Yeah.
Like, how wicked and satanic even to do such a thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, the martyrs of Compiègne were these Carmelites that were taken in carts down to the square and then guillotined one at a time, beginning, I think, with the youngest and going up to the old. So the Mother Superior was the last. So as they're going to the guillotine, they're all singing the Veni Creator Spiritus. And then there's a very dramatic moment where each time one of the sisters is beheaded, there's one less voice, one dropping out of the choir, until by the end, it's just the Mother Superior alone singing it. And so because I mentioned that specific song in the text, and I specifically said the voices drop out, Kevin had to replicate that in the recording.
I'm glad he did, because it's beautiful. What do you want to play?
I'll play it, but I'll just point out that,
tell us what you did.
First of all, there's a lot of recordings of Veni Creator Spiritus, but a lot of them have men, monks, or just a male mixed choir, whatever. I didn't have any of just women. It took a while to find one. I found the beautiful one I mentioned a minute ago, but it didn't have voices dropping out, so I didn't have a solo to use for the Mother Superior at the very, very end. So I had to call over Conor's daughter, Mary, who's a great singer.
Awesome.
She came into my home studio there.
This was very special.
And sang the final line so that we could cut her head off.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. So when you guys are listening to that chapter in volume 3, the first part is a recording that you got from some nuns in Los Angeles or something like that. And then when it drops to the solo, that is Conor's daughter singing.
That's right. So here are the nuns. I'll just jump to the middle. So, very beautiful. And then I'll skip over to what I recorded with Mary.
And then you blended them together, and you had like the sound effect of the guillotine going.
I don't know how long we're here for.
Do you have that?
Yeah, I mean, we could do,
play
two and a half minutes would cover like that scene, or I could just jump to the end and have,
Well, let's play the last minute or something. I don't know.
I'll just jump in a random spot.
It's just so beautiful. And people cry.
Look at them.
They do.
A woman called.
See if they do not have the air of angels.
So you made me do French,
By
and I
my
hate you for
faith,
it.
if these women did not all go straight to paradise, then no one is there.
The first to die was the youngest, Sister Constance. She ascended the steps calmly, laid her head in place, and waited for the terrible machine to do its work. The heavy metal blade came crashing down. Sister Constance's head plopped into a basket. And
It's
her
all in the
soul
text.
Flew up to
It's
heaven.
not my fault.
The sisters continued to sing. The killing took about
We're
a
saying it's
half
beautiful
hour
and then
as the nuns
laughing about
continued
blood
to
squirts.
sing.
It's not- it's-
With each
it's- I don't know
sister
what
who
to do.
ascended the steps and each thwack of the guillotine, one more voice of the Veni Creator Spiritus fell silent. Finally, only the Mother Superior was left,
Oh, see
clinging
how you
to a
blended it?
small statue of the Blessed Mother and continuing on the verses of the hymn alone. She ascended the steps calmly and positioned her head. The blade was reset. The only sound was Mother Teresa's voice singing, "Far from us drive the foe we dread, and grant us thy peace instead." The blade fell. All was silent.
Wow,
The nuns of the Carmelite convent of Compiègne were no more.
Amazing.
the way
Awesome
that you
story.
the way that you decided to leave that pause in there and just let it go on and drag kind of uncomfortably long was great.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
It's amazingly written. It's an amazing story. I think the nuns
That's
that got
awesome.
their heads cut off should get most of the credit.
Yeah.
Probably
not
so.
you jokers.
Yeah.
But the martyrs.
I was telling Kevin before we were recording that like people, like kids have come to me and said that they've like cried listening to that particular story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's unbelievable. Yeah. So it's really well done. You know, I'm glad to hear that was like one of your favorite things to work on.
No matter how good a sound designer or voice actor might be, if the text is bad, it's just
no.
not
This is the total package. This is why this has been so overwhelmingly successful. And by the way, actually on this, I don't know, but we've just recently hired someone. I'll just leave her unnamed for the moment, but we've just hired somebody with an incredible resume, extremely qualified to lead our education and curriculum division. And
cool.
part of the thing she's going to do is focus on taking the curriculum we have, which the Story of Civilization is one of the main components of that, and taking it to classical Catholic schools and diocesan schools and trying to sell it into that, because homeschoolers have really benefited from this. A handful of small classical academies have used this, but we need to roll this sucker out to a much broader audience. And there's a lot of Catholic schools now that have.
It's being used in the Archdiocese of Denver.
Yes.
I know that, but it
we
should
know
be
that,
being used in many more places.
Yeah, we want it all over the country. So it's time to roll this out to the schools. So we just made a substantial investment into an executive who will lead this charge. And so, this is going to be like the second life of this whole series.
Yeah, we've had enough of them coming to us saying, how can we align this with the curriculum requirements of the state or whatever it is?
And that has to be tweaked a little bit, because we have to like make it fit their sequence. So, but we're going to do it.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Yeah, I've also been happy to, speaking of homeschoolers using this, like the creativity of homeschooling families and adapting this has been insane. Like there's a Facebook group that I follow called like TAN Story of Civilization Unofficial. And it's a group of homeschool moms basically collaborating. Do you know about this group?
No.
Okay, well I lurk in this group all the
That's
time.
awesome.
I don't really post. Sometimes I do.
What's your pseudonym when you're in there?
No, I'm just there as myself.
Okay.
But I just watch it, and it's called TAN Story of Civilization Unofficial. And basically, it's like a group of moms that just share ideas about how they've like they'll be like, oh, today for the lesson on ancient Egypt, we made these ancient Egyptian like cakes, and like they show their recipe, or they're like, here's my costume of a medieval, but like I'm constantly astounded at the creativity that the parents themselves and the families bring to this. And then every now and then I'll pop in, I'll be like, that's cool. And then they'll be like, we love the book. But it's really neat to see what parents and kids themselves have brought to this beyond what I wrote it, but like I'm not very creative about that sort of stuff. I never would have been like, here's a costume or a recipe.
Arts and crafts.
Yeah.
Egyptian cookies. Who
Yes.
knows, right?
Oh man, yeah, it's so cool.
That's amazing.
That's like the homeschool life in general. I mean, the creativity that's employed there every day. It's amazing.
Well, that's the thing. I think if you're a homeschooling, particularly if you're a homeschooling mom, usually 90% of the time, mom's driving that ship.
Yeah.
But if you're a homeschooling mom, I think really, really, really rigid curriculums for homeschooling mom is like defeating the purpose, because they're already highly creative people who they want to do it their own way anyway. I mean, that's part of the reason that they're inclined to homeschool to begin with, because they want to have their own personal flair to this.
Yeah.
So like boxing mom into a box, when the whole idea of homeschooling was to get outside of the box.
Yeah.
So when we've created a homeschool curriculum, not just history, but our other stuff, we try to create as a flexible model as possible, and I think they benefit from that a lot.
Well, yeah, when we were first putting together the idea for Civilization, it was like the Schoolhouse model, which was that, as you explained it to me, you're going to have multiple age groups that are using this on multiple different levels and with a lot of inherent flexibility in how it's utilized.
Yeah.
How did you tackle like the vocabulary level with the Schoolhouse model? I don't know anything about what that's like, but knowing it's going to be read to young children by their parents or older siblings and read by the older siblings themselves.
Well, I kind of, so the Schoolhouse model was where you guys would say, well, we want to target this age group, like maybe 4th to 5th grade, but please keep in mind that maybe older kids will read it and younger kids will read it also. And I was like, it's like, so basically I wrote to the oldest age group because I didn't want the oldest demographic to be like, I hate when you get a book when you're a kid and you're like, oh, this is too little kiddish for me, So I wrote to the oldest age group, but I made sure that through contextual cues that the younger age groups, if it was being read to them, that through context, surrounding text, they would be able to figure out what it was about, or sometimes I would just simply define the word. I'd say, transubstantiation, which means, or whatever, and then there would be enough surrounding context to put it together, which was basically, something that I picked up in my years, just as an educator, but also a lot of people don't realize or forget, like, I'm actually an academically trained educator too. I have 5 years in like an education program, from Madonna University, studying child psychology, curriculum development, classroom management, all this stuff. And as one of the things I remember, I spent a semester, I had to go down to like Detroit and tutor like kind of like underprivileged kids in how to read every week. And so you had to take kids that read way below their level. And I had to like try to teach, I'd pick a book and be like, we got to read this and teach them to understand. So I kind of imported a lot of those comprehension strategies to writing to different age groups simultaneously. Write the text itself to the highest age group, but leave enough cues in how the vocabulary is handled and how the text is structured that the younger kids can understand through context.
It worked.
It did work.
On the audio, one of the things I was tasked with was, Kevin, make sure that mom and dad aren't going to want to drive the car off the bridge by listening to this over and over and over. So it can't be too childish. It's got to sound good enough for adults to listen to.
No, it can.
And enjoy.
I've listened to it. I've just ridden my car and listened.
I mean, the text, it all starts with the text. And I'll say it 100 more times on this episode, but it all starts with the text. And I could not have done hopefully what I accomplished without you accomplishing what you did.
Well, there's a rule of thumb when you're dealing with children's literature, is that it has to be interesting to the adult, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like you've probably had this, you're reading a book to your kid and you are thinking like, this book sucks. Can I say sucks?
Yes, you can.
Okay.
Worse things have been said.
Yeah, you're kind of like, this book is no good.
Yeah.
And if you think it's no good, what do you think the kid thinks? So it has to be interesting for the adult who's going through it with them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. What are some of your favorite parts in history? After you spent so much time in history, I wanted to ask you about the Cadaver Synod because that's hilarious. But are there other things that you can talk about that?
We should listen to that one too, by the way.
Okay, great.
Do we have an audio drama of the Cadaver Synod?
I have the Cadaver Synod, yeah.
Oh my God.
It's one of my favorite ones.
Let's just do it.
Yeah?
Let's listen to the Cadaver Synod.
You can explain it after. Yeah, how about that? That sounds good.
I forgot I even wrote that.
The papal court was crowded with observers. Clerics murmured to one another about the proceedings they were witnessing. Pope Stephen paced back and forth in front of the chair of St. Peter, thundering out accusations against the man seated in the chair. Is it not true that you have violated the canons of the Holy Church by taking possession of an episcopal see illegally? What do you say for yourself?
The flies.
Pope Formosus sat silently in the chair, gazing off blankly with dark, hollow eye sockets. A fly buzzed. The clerics in attendance held their noses to stave off the foul odor coming from Formosus. By what right do you wear those pontifical garments? Continued the angry Pope Stephen, gesturing to Formosus's vestments. Formosus was fully clad in elaborate pontifical regalia, complete with the papal ring, shoes, and papal mitre upon his head. Well, have you no answer? Demanded Pope Stephen. A deacon standing near the chair of Formosus stood up. Well, Your Holiness, given that the Pope of Formosus has been dead for over a year, it is unlikely that he can answer. The assembled clerics chuckled. I know that, Pope Stephen snapped. I'm not expecting a year-old corpse that I dug up and dressed in pontifical clothes to reply. That's not the point. The point is that he is publicly accused of his crimes and suffers humiliation for them, even if it is only symbolic. Very well, said the deacon, covering his face and swatting away the flies that buzzed about Formosus's corpse.
That's my favorite part, the flies.
What other charges do you bring against the late pontiff? Pope Stephen went on to accuse Formosus of many other crimes before turning to the assembled clerics. What say you, clergy of Rome? The clerics looked at each other awkwardly before an older bishop rose to his feet. Holy Father, these proceedings are most
unusual.
But if the late Formosus is truly guilty of all the things that you accuse him, then he was unworthy of the chair of St. Peter. Then by the authority of that same St. Peter, whose chair Formosus was unworthy to hold, I invalidate all his actions, declare his appointments null and void, and proclaim him an enemy of the Church of God.
You remember what he does at the end?
Pope Stephen nodded to a group of acolytes standing off to the side. They came forward and threw the body of Formosus upon the ground and stripped all the pontifical garments off the corpse. Pope Stephen then knelt beside the body and, taking a knife, cut off 3 fingers on Formosus's right hand.
Oh, man.
The ones the dead pope had once used to bless the people.
That's like cutting a fruit or something.
Pope Stephen
Sound
rose to
effects.
his feet,
blessing, that thing?
holding aloft the severed fingers and waving them before the clergy. With a fire in his eye, he bellowed, It appears Formosus will no longer be able to offer blessings to the people. The clergy looked at each other with grave concern.
Perfect for little kids.
Yeah, this is great for little
is
kids.
a little low, one of them muttered. God have a mercy.
There you go.
Well, I bet Story of the World doesn't have that.
I absolutely not.
Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.
You know, this was a little bit of a challenge. Well, I mean, there was some things that were kind of edgy, you know, that we had to deal with. And I decided early on that I was just going to deal with them because that's what you do in history. It's like, what are you going to do? That happened.
Yeah, you gonna change history?
Yeah. And, you know, I tried to be not like traumatizing in describing these things. It's more traumatizing with your sound effects in it.
Sorry,
Which is cool.
moms everywhere.
But you know what was really funny? Like, after I wrote the first book and like heard what you did with the audio drama, for the subsequent books, I was able to write the stories with the audio drama in mind, which you told me to do about not being so specific with certain things. So when I would like write the flies in my head, I'd be writing and in my head, I'd hear like zzz, like Kevin putting the flies, and I was like, oh, this is going to be so good when he puts these flies in there. That's a really
so
interesting
much fun.
story, though. You guys know the backstory of that?
No,
Like,
please explain it. Yeah.
Yeah, so this was in like the like period of history where the papacy was being really kind of enmeshed with like the political affairs of the late Carolingian Empire. And for
So what years are we talking about?
this is like in the I want to say it's in like the late 800s.
Okay.
Right? So Formosus had been a bishop under the previous pope, John VIII, I believe. And John VIII, there was a lot of wrangling over who was going to control the empire of Charlemagne. There was all these different claimants to the throne. And the pope had supported one claimant, and Formosus thought that this was a bad idea and had supported a rival. And so this bishop kind of made himself an enemy of the pope. And Formosus fled from Rome because he feared for his life, because this was a period when there was like a lot of imprisonments and assassinations and stuff like that. So he fled from Rome, and the pope considered him an enemy. And the Pope, John VIII, ordered him to come back to Rome and face judgment for fleeing, abandoning his episcopal see. And so Formosus came back and submitted himself to the judgment of the Pope. And the Pope stripped him, said you're not allowed to exercise any priestly functions, and kind of confined him to like doing penance.
For being a coward?
Yeah, essentially. Well, I don't know if it's a coward to leave if you think you're going to be murdered. I mean, but... It's up for interpretation.
I won't judge.
Yeah, by all accounts, Formosus was an honorable, man. But at any rate, the next pope reversed the judgment and brought Formosus back into the administration, said you can exercise your functions. And then for the next three popes, he distinguished himself well in Rome and had a good reputation. And then he was elected to the papacy, I want to say in like 891. He immediately got embroiled in one of these political things with the empire. So there was an Emperor Guy of Spoleto, if you need to know, the Duke of Spoleto, who was like despoiling the papal states. And I think Formosus made a mistake here in getting involved in this. He went to a rival political figure, a guy named Arnulf of Carinthia, and said on the sly, will you please come into Italy and overthrow the emperor and get him off of my back? And I'll give you the throne and I'll crown you. And so this other guy came in, Arnulf, and tried to defeat the emperor. And then the House of Spoleto ended up not being overthrown. They endured. Formosus died. And then the next pope was kind of like a creature of the House of Spoleto, Stephen VI. And the emperor's family, especially the emperor's wife, Adgeltrude, she pressured him to condemn the memory of the previous pope who had supported the wrong side in the Civil War. And so they dug his corpse up and put him on trial. And basically, they dug up all the old accusations from 20 years earlier and threw them at him now that he was unable to, respond. And everything in the text happened. They dressed him up, they cut his fingers off, and they threw his body in the river. Now, the interesting about the story is a pious monk, rescued the body. After it had been dug up for a year, thrown in the river, a monk dragged it out and kept it safe until Pope Stephen died. And then another pope, after this, went back and nullified what Pope Stephen did. So it's crazy. You have Pope Stephen nullifying Formosus, the next pope nullifying Stephen. It was just crazy. And eventually he received a proper burial. But that's not a very nice time in papal history, but it really happened. But it was all political,
It sounds like when we get a new president, they come in, all their executive orders just undo what the previous one did and back and forth.
Oh, yeah, like when you get in charge, you're going to undo the mini circles.
Exactly.
Pull those things out.
Can you imagine like with the popes that have been alive in our lifetimes?
Yeah.
And imagine
that happened.
if this actually happened.
Oh, yeah.
It'd be amazing.
Well, it could happen.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're sitting here
In an interregnum right now.
By the time this comes out, we will have a new pope.
We will, but will they dig up a corpse? That's
hope
kind of
not.
what I meant.
Not anytime soon.
Let's hope not.
So,
But it shows this story does show that like popes can nullify the deeds of previous popes. Like they tend to have continuity now. They want to show that they're in solidarity. But if there was ever something really controversial, like a future pope could just be like, I nullify what that previous pope did, and like cancel everything,
Well, we see in Trump taking office, these executive orders are just, they're just rampant.
Flying out,
yeah. And so, I mean, the next pope who comes in, again, by the time you're listening to this, you have a new pope, because we're about to go into the conclave.
Yeah.
But I don't know if that's good to like say when we record these things. I don't know. I guess we might not
Too late.
release this for a month or two. I don't know exactly, but
Yeah, puts us on the hook to release it quickly.
Yeah, actually, I think we're gonna probably release this later in the summer when we really start to push Story of Civilization. It probably is a good timing to kind of let the homeschooling families who love our homeschool material. We'll probably release it then. So yeah, you've had a pope for now for a couple months, but you can't help but wonder if the restrictions on the Latin Mass are going to be overturned like that, and many other things, So, and I think we will have, by the time you hear this, we will have had some episodes that we're going to release before this, hopefully before the conclave, about what are some of these things that Pope Francis has done in his, how many years?
12
years.
Yeah.
And some argue that he has really changed moral theology teachings in the church, multiple things. And so we're going to have a guest soon. I won't say his name, but we're having an expert on that come in next week to record. And we're going to release it right away because everyone's talking about Pope Francis right now.
I mean, it's not approximating to Formosus and Stephen, but Pope Francis's Traditionis Custodes is essentially like a nullification of Summorum Pontificum, and then you could have another pope basically nullify Traditionis Custodes. And
can you talk about that more? I mean, you just sounded pretty knowledgeable on it.
I said some Latin. Well, it's kind of interesting. Benedict XVI's Summorum Pontificum had said that no priest needs permission to say the Latin Mass.
Correct.
Because he said in principle the Latin Mass was never, he said in fact it was never outlawed, and in principle it could never be outlawed because it was a perennial right of the church, and it would be like a pope trying to outlaw the rosary or something like that.
Right.
It's a perennial traditional liturgy. And so this was and Benedict was very insightful in this. He didn't just want to say, I legalize the traditional Latin Mass by like papal fiat, because he knew that a successor could just undo that. He was trying to say this actually can't be banned because of these reasons. And then Traditionis Custodes comes along, and if you read Traditionis Custodes, Francis not only undoes what Benedict said, but he takes a completely different approach to it. He says that he's revoking the provisions Summorum Pontificum and restricting the Latin Mass again because he said that the fruits of the Latin Mass expansion under Benedict had not been good and that it contributed to division. But he kind of just ignores the principle that Benedict had elaborated, which was that it can't be restricted in principle. And he just kind of sidesteps it and ignores that fact and says, I'm restricting it. So it's
almost like end justifies the means. He's saying, well, the end result was bad, which I disagree with.
Yeah.
But he's saying the results are bad, therefore we're just going to change it.
Right. Now, obviously, Summorum and Traditionis Custodes are, they're not dogmatic, infallible definitions, but both of them can't be, like, you can't say in principle you can't ban the Latin Mass and then I'm banning the Latin Mass. Right. Like either Benedict was incorrect in his assertion or Francis, or they're just two different schools of thought on this. Mm-hmm. So that by all accounts, no matter who you ask, the liturgy wars of Francis's pontificate have been pretty destructive in Catholic life. Everybody's kind of, I think when Traditionis Custodes happened, a lot of Catholics were like, wow, really? Like this is what we're going to do? We're going to go back to, after so many fruitful years of having the Latin Mass coexisting with the Novus Ordo. The next pope is going to have to put this back together, and he's either going to have to choose, does he adopt Benedict's view, or is he going to adopt Francis's view, or some other third view on this? I don't know. I mean, I'm hoping that Traditionis Custodes is seen as this aberration. One thing that's interesting in the story of Formosus and Stephen is a lot of the nullifications and the condemnations that Stephen made. Later, they were some were overturned, but many were just ignored. Where the successor said, if we were to take, like, for example, nullifying every person who was ever ordained under this pope and under any bishops that Formosus had ordained, that would cause untold chaos in the church and confusion over who was even a valid priest. And so in the future, many of these condemnations were simply ignored. And I'm hoping that Traditionis will be something like that, where it's either just undone or kind of like the status quo under Benedict creeps back and it's just kind of ignored, and the future pontiffs realize this isn't a fight that we want to have. That's how I'm hoping it goes down.
Yeah, we were speculating, as everyone is right now. about what kind of pope we'll have, and it.
Well, Francis, I don't know if named, not elevated. I don't know. 21 new cardinals back in December.
Mm-hmm.
That's 15% of the voting cardinals in the college.
Yeah, stacking the decks.
Yes,
but
exactly.
but there's an old saying in Rome that a fat pope follows a skinny pope.
Yeah,
and the whole idea there is like the pendulum swings back and forth.
Yeah,
and you made an astute observation during lunch about what why one might argue that it's likely to get a little bit more of a conservative. But would you say that again? Elaborate a little bit.
Well, yeah, there's. People tend to look at the papacy through the lens of like conservative or liberal, but you have to also look at it through the lens of like the stability of the institution of the church itself. And regardless of what you think about Francis's ideas, the way he's managed the church has been very destabilizing. He's kind of like upended a lot of traditional institutions. He's thrown a lot of the episcopacy into chaos by the uncertainty that comes out of Rome. And very much been, we've seen for the first time that I know of in modern history of Pope just simply firing bishops as if they're employees, whereas Vatican II and the Catechism makes it very clear that bishops are, obviously they're under the Pope, they're not autonomous, but they have a true jurisdiction that's proper to the bishop. They're not simply like, they're not like employees, right? And you see the Pope simply firing bishops. So I think that if you look at the institution, I think the bishops and the cardinals look at this and saying, we don't want another person that's going to upend the institution like this, who's going to cause so much chaos, who's going to perhaps be seen as trespassing on the autonomy of bishops and cardinals. We want someone who's going to respect the established order because kind of like in the corporate world, if the person at the top is screwing everything up and causing chaos and confusion, they're not going to want someone like that. It's better to have like a bureaucrat who maybe isn't as visionary, maybe isn't as going to push all these changes. He's a boring pencil pusher, but he knows how to manage the organization, And so maybe you're going to get someone who's not as inclined to push all these changes, who's maybe going to be more conservative and say, no, I want to buttress the existing institutions, reaffirm the role of the episcopacy and all these other congregations instead of just sidestepping them all.
Yeah, it's remarkable. I mean, people are going, whether you're liberal or conservative, if you're a bishop, you desperately right now want some stability coming out of the institution.
Yes.
Because, I mean, everyone would agree, I think, unless they're just being dishonest, that Rome has been, quote unquote, confusing.
Yeah,
that's like the aphorism that they use. Things are a bit confusing.
Shook things up.
Yeah, and that's just a nice way of them saying this is chaotic.
Yeah, now
the administration of the institution is chaotic.
Right, setting aside the
ideology.
The ideology. Yeah, like now that Francis has passed, you're seeing the word chaos being used a lot more to describe the pontificate and the state of the institution. Yeah. Where I think when he was alive, they're being more confusing.
Being more polite.
We're getting mixed signals.
Diplomatic.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So interesting times in the church, but all of this, hearing the story of, the
Cadaver Synod.
These early popes, just invalidating what the previous guy said, flip and flop. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the Eastern churches saying this is ridiculous. This papacy has become just a bureaucratic political institution. We're out of here. Like I'm sympathetic. No, I'm not. I'm not a schismatic. But we had Father Michael O'Loughlin, who's a Ruthenian Byzantine priest, sitting here just recently, and this is why I'm so attracted. One of the reasons I'm so attracted to the Eastern Rite churches in union with Rome. Sure. Is because they just seem to be immune to all of this stuff. I mean, the papacy is something important to them, but their bishops don't seem to be, and their liturgy certainly is not, subject to the whims of whatever personality happens to be in the office.
Well, what you find when you study church history and take like a broad picture of a lot of the stuff is that there is no perfect mode of church governance. Like, Are there things that I like in Protestantism, that I think they do better than Catholics? Sure. Yeah, I find like in the Protestant world, since they don't have a liturgy, like you're expected to be a better preacher.
Yes, great point.
So like you're expected to be a good preacher, like a good public speaker. Whereas a Catholic priest, often, we just kind of acclimate ourselves to, if we're being honest, most homilies are going to be mid. Every now and then you're going to get a good one, and then you're often going to get like a boring one. But it's because the preaching isn't the centerpiece of our, and whether you have like the structure of governance of the Eastern churches, they have their own cons. Like if you're in the Eastern world, there's things that they gripe about over there, stemming, for example, from the highly ethnic nature of a lot of the communions in the East, and how what sort of identity we have as whatever blank Catholics that's outside of that ethnic identity, So there's situations there. There's certainly problems with the papal mode of governance. There's problems with like the congregational mode that Protestants use. None of these are perfect, and so for me, it's not really a question of what are the problems we have based on our mode of governance. I'm sympathetic with various other, I understand the sympathy, and I'm not interested in going schismatic or anything either. But I think the history helps put this stuff in perspective. Like there's been crazy things that have happened, and now is crazy. We live in a crazy time. And I think one reason why things seem so crazy is those of us who are old enough, we like John Paul II's pontificate and Benedict XVI. If you were an Orthodox Catholic, you were used to the idea that like whatever is going on here, Rome has my back. Like the good teaching is coming out of Rome, and I know, I can look to Rome and there's clarity in what the teaching is. And in times that are more confusing in what Rome's doing, you even have some statements recently of like United States being thrown under the bus, or like Francis said, very kind of like dismissive things of American Catholicism, and all of a sudden you feel very disoriented. Like this figure in Rome was supposed to be the bulwark, and now it's kind of like confusing. Yeah,
I've heard a lot of priests say they feel like they don't have a spiritual father.
Yeah, it's very, very, very sad. Yeah. But I think this is part of that pendulum, I can imagine there's other times in history where people have probably felt the same way about what was going on in Rome.
So as a historian, when you hear, today's crazy times, in our modern age, we talk and complain about things of this age. Yeah. But the world's always kind of sucked, right? I mean, there's always been problems back, God flooded the whole world at one point. Christians were getting brutalized all over the planet since Christ was here. Yeah. When you hear, of course, our world is more crazy and more troubled today. But you read every time somebody writes a cultural article on something, they talk about how bad today is. Yeah. But they've always done that. Like every time I've read history, every single saint has talked about how bad their current age is, and there was a little bit of nostalgia
for some earlier
about previous periods. Yeah. And so like as a historian, you must have an acute awareness of that.
Yeah. Well, I don't believe in any golden ages. I went back reading the writers of like the 13th century, like the age of Aquinas, and like when Francis and Aquinas were alive in what is considered the golden age of Catholic culture. And when you read them, they were saying like their age was so bad, they thought that the Antichrist must be about to emerge, like there's no golden ages. Yeah. Every age has it. See, I think God really gives each age its own sort of cross to carry, and obviously there's good things and some things are bad. I love the architecture of the 13th century over today, any day of the week, but it had its own problems, we have our own problems. One thing I've kind of figured out on this subject is that, the previous ages, they are not, I don't know, we have to just kind of look at what's given us. God put us here in the 21st century, and he wants us to deal with what's here. The church has, this is kind of fascinating to think about. The church has always been on the verge of destruction. Yeah. Right. Like, I thought like, wow, it was really hard for the church in the Roman Empire. They almost got, then I was like, but then it became legalized. But then actually it almost got destroyed by these heresies. And then actually Islam almost, and then actually the Vikings almost, and then actually, and then, oh my gosh. And then there was the schism, and then, but then the Protestants, and I was like, actually, okay, but then there was the French Revolution, then communism, and when you read about it, you're like, oh my gosh, it's like always on the verge of collapse.
Amazing.
Like, so when people are like, the church is like in utter, it's about to whatever, it's like, that's literally how it's always been. And the continuity is almost like you see the crisis in the moment, and the continuity is more visible in retrospect. You know, when you see like, yes, all those things happened, but there was this beautiful continuity that persisted in spite of it. You know?
That's perfectly said. That's what I was looking for.
Yeah.
There's a clip right there, Nick. That's it right there, but right there. That seriously, the church has always been
about to collapse.
Yes. It's a beautiful, which shows the divine protection of it.
Yeah.
Because it's not going to collapse.
Everything
It's
else
never
has
gonna-
collapsed.
Everything else has collapsed. It's not going to collapse.
Yeah,
you know?
it's always been Peter standing on the waves saying, "Save me, Lord, I'm sinking." Like, it's always been that.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Speaking of that, one of the things that we want to talk about is iconography, and because
Iconoclasm too.
iconoclasm. So we were talking about the East.
Yeah.
It's a great part of history. We had the Byzantine priest recently here. We were looking at the icons, are beautiful.
Yeah.
We're talking about architecture used to be so much more beautiful. Like, there's so many reasons to
More
talk about
meaningful
it.
too. The symbolism.
Far more meaningful. In fact, I was just at I was on EWTN a couple days ago, and my son and I then went to the Shrine of the Blessed Sacrament in Huntsville, Alabama, or wherever that is. I took David, my 11-year-old, but we went into the huge gift shop they have there, and there's like 1 million different pieces of art you can buy. But I've noticed when I go into a Catholic gift shop these days, all I really want to see is the icons. Like, I'm loving the icons more and more. But anyway, talk to us about
Real quick.
Go ahead.
Did you guys see with Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris when they reopened it? Like,
No.
The renovation of the whole church is beautiful. Pretty much all of the church was restored as closely as possible to the original style, except the altar. And the altar is this
hideous.
ugly. Yeah, it's this ugly big bowl, like stone.
Yeah, I saw that. It's
granite.
an ugly stone bowl.
Yeah,
I hate that so much.
man.
But the churches in France are owned by the government, basically.
Yeah, well, that's what I heard, right or wrong, was the government really insisted on
The traditional.
on the traditional.
Yeah,
yeah,
and it was the Catholic
For tourism?
Yeah.
Is that why?
Yeah, for the historical aspect of it. But then it was the church where they had their one bit of authority on the altar. They were like, we're going to put this ugly thing in that has no meaning and symbolism at all.
Oh gosh. Anyhow, icons.
Sorry.
No.
Yeah, talk to us about that. Talk to us about that whole period of the church, because it's kind of fascinating.
Yeah, and it's relevant because we see that today. So we're like, iconoclasm was this period in church history that lasted from like the early 700s into the 800s, where in the East and even in the West, there was this strong reaction against the use of images in Christian worship. And this was mandated by the state, by the Byzantine emperors. Started with a guy named Leo III, and it went on for several successors. There was 5 or 6 or 7 iconoclast emperors where they forbid the use of images in worship, and they went to the churches and whitewashed the images of Christ and the saints, forbid any icons. And then they went even further. I wasn't aware of this at first, but they went even further. They destroyed and threw away a lot of the relics of the saints as well. Basically, any of the visual representations, because they said that it was superstition. And it was basically like talking about rationalism. It was like a hyper rationalist reaction against piety towards external forms and figures, right? And you had like the monks in the East who were defending the use of icons, and the iconoclast party was really in the military. It's interesting. It was like the monks versus the military, and the emperors were on the side of the military, pushing it. And it's a very fascinating time in church history. It actually starts with a dispute with the Umayyad Caliph in Damascus, where this Byzantine emperor, I think Justinian II. So when the Arabs first took over the Middle East, they didn't have any administration yet, and they were still using Byzantine coinage for their currency. And Justinian II issued a coin that had a picture of Christ on the back side of it. And the Caliph in Damascus refused to circulate this coin because it was like a blasphemous image of Christ. And so he ended up circulating coins that just had verses of the Quran, right? And in the Byzantine Empire, you had the Byzantine emperors started seeing this issue of images as a stumbling block for Jews and Muslims, right? So I think if we could just get rid of images, it'd be easier to kind of either convert Muslims and Jews or come to peace with them or whatever. Some people say it was actually influenced by Islam's prohibition on images, because as Islam was spreading throughout the East, they were kind of de-Christianizing these old Christian territories, trying to get rid of symbols of Christianity publicly. The genesis of this is kind of unknown. There's actually always been a strain in Christianity that was kind of opposed to images, a very minority strain associated with certain heresies that were believed the material world was evil, right? But at any rate, eventually one of these guys gets to the imperial throne, Leo III, and he issues all these edicts against icons and whitewashes them, destroys them, and persecutes the monks who are defending them. Very awful, like floggings and scourgings. He had the Patriarch of Constantinople blinded and paraded through the street in humiliation, right? Because of the idea that they said that to venerate an image was a heresy. They said either you're Monophysite or you're Nestorian, because the divinity can't be. The argument is that the divinity can't be represented visually. Like the actual divinity itself is beyond human comprehension. So you can't represent it visually. So either you're going to end up confounding the two natures of Christ or separating them, and it's like de facto heretical to make an image of our Lord. And that was the argument. They tried to force this on the Pope. They tried to force it on Gregory II, and the Pope wrote back this very spicy letter to Leo. I was reading it this week. It was very funny. He kind of calls him stupid. He's like, in very diplomatic way, he's like, I'm shocked that your grace does not understand this teaching. But he, and the emperor threatens to come kidnap Pope Gregory, and Gregory kind of says, I'll just run away into Campania and you won't find me. And it's this great, Tan should republish these letters, honestly. No, but it's these great exchange, and the West kind of stands firm against it, whereas the East goes full-blown into iconoclasm. And it must be hard to imagine living in that situation. That's because it went on for a long time. I think it was in 718 or 720 that the first iconoclasm started, and it went on till 842. So that's 122 years that this was going on. And in the meantime, the Christians who want to worship with icons are being continuously persecuted. They're having their churches physically altered. It was funny, they would paint over the icons and they would replace them with images of plants and birds. And the Christians would complain. They'd say, this doesn't feel like a sacred space. It feels like a florist shop or a bird store is what they would say. And I was like, man, I resonate with that. What I hear.
I mean, this sounds like
modern day churches.
Post-Vatican II destruction of high altars.
It does.
Yeah, really.
It does. But it went on for so long. And there was even two phases of it. They had a whole council in 787, the Second Council of Nicaea, that overturned all the iconic, finally got it back to how it should be. And then you got another wave of it 20 years later where another iconoclast emperor came in and wiped everything out. And the reason they kept doing this is because the iconoclast emperors were successful militarily because the army was on their side. Sure. And when Byzantium started having reverses against the Muslims, they started yearning for the good old days of like the powerful iconoclastic emperors, and they brought them back, and then they did the whole thing again, and then they had to have a whole another overturning of that. And now that was in 842. They finally brought it to an end, and now the Eastern there's a holy day, the Feast of Orthodoxy, or the Feast of the Restoration of Orthodoxy, which is the first Sunday of Lent, where they celebrate the end of iconoclasm. But it was so integral in the Eastern mindset that they don't call it like the Feast of the Restoration of Icons. They call it the Feast of Orthodoxy, because icons are so integral to the Orthodox view of things in the East. But again, like you were connecting it to modernity, these people dealt with like 122 years of the physical structure of their churches being altered by the state, by the church, by like crony bishops that were in the service of the state, being told that they were heretics, suffering on behalf of these icons. It must have required tremendous fortitude, not only to endure, but to continue to have the rightly ordered supernatural view of the church when that church was complicit in destroying its own heritage.
When I've tried to put terms so I can understand it kind of in my somewhat modern mind, I've tried to understand what was the motive behind the destruction of
High altars,
and then like the building of modern churches and their architecture that they choose, looking like spaceships.
Yeah.
You know, what is the motive? You know.
Yeah.
And I guess I've settled on in my head, and this could be wrong, but there's a hint of this iconoclasm in there, and there's a minimalism. Like we talk about minimalism, and I think that particularly a lot of Benedictine churches they were just Middle Ages. They were beautiful, but more recently they've just been stripped of everything. And they're usually huge, but there's usually very, very. I mean, I've been to many Benedictine monasteries, you know, and I was up in the Norbertine Monastery up in Wisconsin, Green Bay, not too recently, not too long ago. I mean, and in one sense, it's beautiful because it's huge and nice, beautiful stained glass windows, but there's almost no artwork in the building. You know, it's like, where's the artwork? And I got the sense that post-Vatican II, there was a sense of minimalism. Yeah, and they have a sense that when they're in there praying, that the images distract them. Yeah, and so they want less. So that they focus more on their own interior mental prayer. I think that's part of it.
It's a rationalism, and it's kind of an elitism, and kind of like anti-incarnational, almost like you don't need all these external things to distract you. Just focus on what's going on interiorly and in your mind. You know, it's almost like distrusting the material supports of faith that had nourished people for so long. Like kind of like an elitist view of it, like we should all be so spiritually sophisticated that we can just, you know, repose into the sanctuary of our own brain and encounter God in an absolute interiority without any material aids at all. I mean, the medieval people were way smarter than that, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What were you going to say?
Oh, I was just going to say, you know, removing all of it, making it empty. Instead of distraction, you know, they're removing inspiration. Yeah, you know,
there's a city in Michigan, a historic city. I don't want to name it because who knows who's going to hear this, but they have this historic Lutheran church that's like from the frontier days, and it has this beautiful, like handcrafted high altar out of solid wood, and it's got all these Gothic spires, and it's this beautiful. It's a Lutheran church, and it's so pretty, and people come from all over to see this church. And I went to the town and visited there, and then I went to the local Catholic church, and the Catholic church was shaped like it was like a big circle, and it was like under renovation, and I looked at what they were doing, and it was like so minimalist and ugly, you know, it was like disgustingly ugly. So I went to the gift shop and I bought the postcard of the Lutheran church, and then I mailed it to the Catholic church, and I wrote on the back, I was like, this is what you should be doing. Why do the Protestant church look nicer than the Catholic church? You should look like this.
There is something about that. And I remember when Pope Francis, we were talking about him earlier, when he was first appointed and he walked out after the conclave, we get the white smoke, and he walked out on the balcony. Yep. And one of the things that the commentators noticed immediately was he wasn't wearing the normal regalia of the Holy Father. And again, the way the commentators look at that, and I think that kind of has maybe summarized his whole papacy right there in a certain way. Set this tone. That's what he was trying to do. He knows what he was doing. But the idea there is, so you can look at it as the commentators did and say, oh, look how simple and humble and modest, and he doesn't want the fancy dinners, and he doesn't want the fancy clothes, and he's not going to wear the silly red shoes because he's like a walking St. Francis. And that's how they chalk it up to like being Christ-like, you know. But in reality, there is a pride in there, it seems to me, of
He drew attention to himself.
Well, you draw attention
under
to
the
yourself.
guise of trying to shuck attention.
And the thing is like when you submit to the traditions of your office, that's an act of humility as well.
It is.
Say like the Holy Father wears these things and wears these clothes and wears this color sock.
They're not his personal.
They're not
stuff.
his. It's not yours. You know, Ronald Reagan, you know, when he was president, he had a policy that he would never step into the Oval Office without wearing his sport coat. Mm-hmm. Like he didn't go in there in his hoodie and sweatpants just to go grab it. He put on a sports coat out of respect for the office. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I think was lacking, right? And there is a pride in saying, I don't have to follow the traditions of this office.
Exactly.
And it's more too much about you versus about the seat you're sitting in.
I understood this very profoundly from my experience being mayor. Like when I came into the mayoral office, they showed me like my physical office, and there was like these big cases in there with all these mementos that have been given to previous mayors over the generations going back. You know, anytime like a foreign visitor had showed up, they'd bring the mayor a little gift, you know, or just various things that had happened. And this was part of the office. And I had a specific desk, and there was little specific rituals and stuff like that that had just kind of been passed on. And there was like mayoral photos. Like if you go to the city of Howell to this day and go in the basement, there's like a whole lineup of all the historic mayors going back to whenever. And I'm right there in the lineup with a certain kind of standardized photo with all of them. And I thought to myself, like, how pretentious it would have been if I went in and was like, get all these mementos out of here. Like, I don't need this in my office. I don't want to be showy, you know. Or if I was like, I'm going to take my photo a different way, you know. Absolutely. It was like, I went in there and I was like, this is a heritage that, like, from, you know, whether I agreed with my predecessor or not, the office has a continuity. This has come down from the predecessors from time immemorial. Like, people couldn't even remember in Howell, because it's an old city, they couldn't even remember where a lot of these things came from, you know, or what the, you know, there'd be like some weird trophy or a ball or something in the case, and there was no memory of who had given it or under what conditions. You know, am I going to be the weak link that breaks that? No, I absolutely kept all that stuff there. I added to it. I had my own mementos that I added to it. And then I, you know, left that office to my predecessor the way I had found it, you know, and I thought that was the only responsible way to handle it.
Beautiful analogy. That's dead on. That's dead on. So I'm just kind of curious. Yeah,
I noticed something, just to go back 1 second. We're talking from iconoclasm to some political stuff. Yeah. When you said there was like the 20-year gap and there was like a second phase of iconoclasm where they had this strong man came in to the emperor position. It reminds me of World War I, World War II Germany, right? It had this 20-year gap. You could articulate it a million times better than me. Yeah. But I'm sitting there seeing, okay, World War II happened. Yeah. You know, after a 20-year, 30-year, you know, pause, and then a strong man comes back in.
That's a good analogy. Yeah. When things go chaotic, people want a strong guy to come in and sort it out.
Mm-hmm.
You want to talk about story of the church and story of Mary? You know, and it's something that people know story of civilization so well.
Yeah. So,
but they don't know the others as well. And I'd like to talk a little bit about what that was like for you.
Yeah, I really wanted to do so. Like after Civilization, one of the frustrating things about doing Civilization was trying to figure out where the boundary was between church stuff and like more just history stuff.
Sure.
Because a lot of times, like, this is obviously a Catholic curriculum, so we want to include the Catholic contribution to history. But I also had to maintain a clear distinction in my mind, like, okay, this is a history book. It's not a church book. It's not about the church. It's about Western history. So I had to figure out where the boundaries were of leaving certain things out. And then I thought, there's so many things I wish I had the time to delve into, though. Like, if I was talking about the 1700s, it would have been great to have time to talk about Louis de Montfort and the spread of like devotion to, you know, doing consecration to Our Lady, you know, because that was a big part of Catholic spirituality, or talk about St. Bernard.
Yeah, pause there, footnote. Do you know what Louis de Montfort's nickname was when he was on Earth?
No, what?
Little Bernard.
Really?
Yeah.
Little Bernard.
Yeah, because Mariology, I mean, Bernard really kind of set the stage for Mariology.
Yeah, he did.
And so when he was alive, writing when Louis de Montfort was alive, that's what they called him. Isn't that amazing?
That's amazing.
That's another plug for Bernard. Sorry, keep going.
No, but at any rate, so I thought, like, we should have a book that just tells the history of the church and focuses that I can really delve into the church stuff. And that was so fun doing that. So yeah, Story of the Church is essentially the story. It's like the story of the church, basically. And it kind of parallels Civilization, but with a focus on ecclesiastical history. And then when we got to Story of Mary, we were thinking that Mary is so integral to Catholic spirituality. And I don't remember, Mary was not my idea. I don't remember who pitched this originally.
Brian Kennelly.
Brian Kennelly, that's right. Yeah, I do remember that.
Shout out to Brian Kennelly, one of our long-term employees, authors. He's now a teacher at Charlotte Catholic High School. He sees it like mission territory, and he's doing great evangelical work there.
And I should shout out to Brian, too. He was the editor for all 4 volumes of Story of Civilization.
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
And my first professional editor that I ever worked with, and what a great guy.
Yeah,
I love to work with him. Yeah. But yeah, Brian pitched Story of Mary, and Story of Mary was a little different because Mary isn't like a history subject, but he believed that I could talk about Mary in the format of Story of Civilization, and he wanted me to, he said basically this is going to be an all-inclusive book about the Blessed Mother. It's going to include Bible, spirituality, history, apparitions, and even like her cultural impact. So we have like chapters on like geographical features named after Mary, chocolates named after Mary, you know, all this wonderful stuff. So it was basically kind of like this book ended up being something where like if you wanted someone who was like, I don't understand the church's devotion to Mary, you could just give them this book, and it's structured like a history book, but when you read it, it's really not. It's really just a book about Mariology that's wearing the disguise of a history book.
Yeah.
And it's people love this book, and I've gotten so many. This book actually has gotten a lot of traction for adults. I think actually most people that talk to me about this book are adults who said like, I never understood this, and my kid got this, and then I read it, and now I get it.
Yeah.
So it has a kind of a universal appeal.
Let's go back to the story of the church for a second.
Yeah.
I've always been fascinated with what the formalities of the early church were like. I mean, from the time of Pentecost, right? Which, as I understand, is really the birth of the church. You know, that's really when it started. And then you have early popes, but you know the bishops are the apostles are going out and evangelizing to the world. But what was this? We know from Acts of the Apostles how Paul and Peter kind of went at it over subjects like circumcision and whatnot. But what was, from your reading, what was that early church? I mean, I don't know, the first couple hundred years. Yeah. What did the church look like?
That's such a big question, Connor.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. The primitive church, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, the fundamental structure that later evolved was still there. You know, like this is one of the things that I learned when I was reading church history is a lot of the stuff that the world thinks are like medieval accretions are all present in the early church. Like, really? I was shocked when I was reading the writings of Saint Cyprian of Carthage and found that indulgences were happening in like the 200s. Wow. Because many people assume like, oh, that's some corrupt thing from the Middle Ages. Yeah. I mean, they're not called indulgences; they're called something else. They're called what are they called? Libelli letters. But they were there, and they were mitigations of penance. I was like, wow, they had indulgences in the 200s. You see all the synods of bishops. You see appeals to the Pope. You see basically the fundamental stuff there. The structure is there. Sometimes the detail, when you read history, the details are very frustrating, the things that people leave out because they think it's so, like you read something from the 200s or 300s and they're like, then they said the Mass, and you're like, what were the prayers? Like, what language were they saying it in? Like, what are the specifics? And they just leave it out because it's so, right. You know, it's kind of like today, like if I was writing about my meeting today, I would not write, then I shook Connor's hand, because we all know we shake hands. But then imagine that gesture was forgotten about, and they're like, how did people greet each other in the 21st century? Nobody wrote it down.
Yeah,
you know?
Right.
So it's very frustrating. I'm working on, just in my spare time, I'm doing some creative writing set in the time of St. Valentine in the 3rd century. And I was trying to write a depiction of the Roman liturgy as it would have been celebrated in Rome around the year 250. And I contacted a scholar friend of mine who's one of the most knowledgeable people I know about the Roman liturgy's history. And I was asking him all these questions about vestments. He was like, we don't know. Like, it probably was like this, but we don't know. There's no evidence of this. Like, he was basically like, just, you know, if I was trying to write accurately, and he was like, no, the better you should just write first whatever you want and then show it to me, and I'll tell you if there's anything glaringly wrong. But he's like, so much of this remains uncertain at the earliest times. I mean, the church was in a state of persecution, you know, and the church used to have a discipline called arcana, which is secret, you know, which was where you don't talk about these things to outsiders, you know, because you could compromise yourself, right? If you're just down in the street corner blabbing about what goes on in the Mass, well, you don't know if the Roman government's about to declare a persecution the next week, and then all of a sudden you've given everything away, you know? So these things were often not spoken about publicly. And when they were spoken about publicly, you often find it under guarded language or mystic language. Like St. Paul, even in the New Testament, he often refers to baptism. There's a few passages where he calls it illumination. And this was a word that was often used in the early church. You can find it in the letters of, I think, St. Cyril and some of the Alexandrians, where they'll refer to baptism as being illuminated. And they have these different ways that they speak. And a lot of times we read them today, we're like, well, I think they're talking about this, but maybe could be something else. So I'm fascinated with it too. But it's hard to speculate. It does seem to have been a little more communal than today. Because they had a common culture, they had a common Greco-Roman culture, and then later as things divided, like, for example, this is one thing that's fun. There used to be orders of penitence when you would commit a sin and you would confess, and instead of getting an individualized personal confession, you would be assigned to an order of penitence. So there was 4 orders of penitence based on the gravity of your sins. And I can't remember all their names, but they were called like the weepers and the standers and in Latin. So like you'd be assigned to like they'd say like, well, Conor, you're going to do 1 year with the weepers. And then your job was at Mass, you'd like sit in the back on your hands and knees and cry, you know, or wail. Or another order was not allowed to enter the church. They'd have to stand outside the church and they'd have to pray. And when the faithful were entering the church, they would say, pray for me. And then the standers were those who were allowed to participate in the liturgy, but they had to like maybe leave at a certain time. And then you had the closest group who could stay through the whole liturgy right through communion, but they didn't have to leave. And they just couldn't receive communion. So your penances that you were assigned were to just be to one of these 4 orders. And then you'd do a certain amount of time, like a sentence, 6 months in the standers, you know, and then you would gradually proceed. So if you got to the worst one, which was outside the door, you'd do like 6 months there. Then you'd go to the people who are inside the door, do 6 months there. Then you'd gradually get a physical proximity to the Eucharist until you were finally readmitted to communion.
Wow, I've never heard that.
But then Christians were also expected to be doing their own private penances as well. But these were like the communal penances. If you had confessed some serious sin, you'd be absolved of. Later, those communal penances all kind of, the 4 orders of penitence kind of vanished away and was replaced by private penances based on individual sins, as seen in like the medieval like Irish penitentiaries. So they would have manuals where now when Kevin commits a sin, instead of saying go to the 3rd order of penitence, they'd say, well, what does the manual say? It says if you confess this sin, bread and water for 30 days, you know, and it would be individualized. And Kevin would be able to do his penance in private, you know, instead of having everyone in the church be like, oh, there he is weeping by the door. He must have done X, Y, or Z to merit that. So that's very interesting how communally oriented they used to be. But this is actually when you say like, what was the rationale? A lot of the reformers in the 60s, like, you know how we have these communal penance services now?
Yes.
Those things weren't a thing before Vatican II.
Right.
They brought that back, or not back, but they created that they're like, oh, the early church is more communal. So we're going to create this communal penance service to try to emulate the early church. But without realizing this is totally different than what the early church was doing, right? Like, very, very different.
Just by plopping the name communal on it doesn't make it like it.
Right. And you're probably aware of this from like the argument about communion in the hand, where they'll be like, people receive communion in the hand in the early church, you know, like kind of ignoring that whenever that happened, it was in entirely different circumstances and procedure than what communion in the hand is today, right? So it's like if people are saying they want a communal penance service today, it's like, I'm going to start saying that, oh, are you going to be like kneeling by the door weeping for 6 months? You know, yeah. Like, is that the plan? Because I'd be down with that, you know? So I think with a lot of these reforms, there was a sense of like, we're recapturing in some vague way the spirit of early Christianity, but not really, because these things aren't even historic.
I wonder if it was the clerics who had to make confession about their sins, and they didn't want to have to do penance outside for 6 months and be publicly humiliated. Yeah. And so I wonder if the guys in charge basically say, well, maybe there's a better way to do this. Maybe we could make it private. Just give me bread and water as a penance.
I think it had to do, honestly, with the rise of monasticism, where instead of having like whole communities of people together, you had like individual monks in their own cells who were doing highly specified, particularized penances. And then those penitential books later got passed down from the monasteries into general circulation.
Yeah.
That's my theory. But I like yours too.
Do you have any sense that this is just a random, curious question. Do you have any sense of how celibacy took shape over the centuries?
Oh, I've written voluminously on celibacy.
Have you really? See, I just figured I'd ask because he just kind of knows everything.
Yeah.
But the first pope was married, okay? How do you explain this? Because now I'll hear you got my Eastern priest friends who can get married or could get married and then become priests. And then you got other people in the West that say that celibacy is a doctrine, and I even heard that when like St. Peter, basically was ordained, for lack of a better word, then he became celibate. I'm like, it was based on what? So help me with how that shaped its over time.
The existing documents that we have going back to I think the 300s suggest that the church did accept married clergy, but never sexually active clergy.
Really?
So that you could be ordained as a married man, but you were expected to abstain from sexual relations after your ordination.
Really?
And that this explains...
That's as early as 300?
Yeah, I think the earliest reference is the Council of Elvira. This is off the top of my head, but I want to say it's before the Council of Nicaea. There's some documents from the 300s, and they refer to it as like a ancient tradition. So in the early church, they consider, now we can argue about whether they were correct or not, but they considered it an apostolic tradition that a consecrated person above the level of deacon, or some would even say subdeacon, were not allowed to be sexually active. And then there was all these safeguards about like, okay, well, if you're married and ordained, you're expected to live like this. This is how this arrangement has to work. And then and you can find all these canons saying like, if an ordained person falls back into having sexual relations, then he's going to be degraded from his office or whatever. Now, over time, what happened was, you can understand that this is a difficult discipline to maintain. You have people living with their spouses and they're being told not to have sexual intercourse. What happened is in the West gradually just phased out that allowance of having married clergy in favor of unmarried clergy entirely, whereas in the East, they phased out the requirement of celibacy and allowed. So,
interesting. Yeah.
Now, I'm very, very oversimplifying it, and if there's any people who know more about this in the comments, you'll hear about it.
Right.
Okay. But there's a book called The Apostolic Origins of Priestly Celibacy by Father Christian Coccini. I think it's published by Ignatius Press. It's very thick. He goes through all the documentation on this and shows all the quotes and whatnot. And I also have multiple articles on this on my blog and website, Unam Sanctam Catholicam.
There you go.
I have
Be in the description.
I have like 30 or 40 pages written on this with all the documentation on it. It's still contested. You'll still find people in the East who have married and sexually active clergy are very offended by this. So please note, when I'm saying this appears to be the tradition, I understand that tradition develops, and I'm not saying that if you're in the East that your tradition is bad or wrong or whatever, but I'm saying that neither the East nor the West today preserves the actual, like what the original tradition was, which was that, yes, you can be married, but you have to be celibate. You don't find that anywhere now, really. And of course, one thing that we do share is that the East and the West at no time was like a consecrated, a person in the higher clergy allowed to get married. You had to be married before you ascended to the clergy. But once you were married, you could never clergy could never be married at that point.
Right. They don't want priest dating.
Now the reason that the discipline changed in the East was because of actually Justinian's law code, where Justinian was concerned about the problem of inheritance, right? About like, let's say you have a married priest and he has children, right? And is going to inherit basically about the alienation of church property. And so increasingly after Justinian's time, he starts trying to regulate, saying like bishops cannot be married, bishops absolutely cannot have spouse. So in the Eastern churches, like a bishop had to be unmarried, right? And what happened was, because the law stipulated specifically that bishops had to be unmarried and couldn't be sexually active, it was gradually assumed that those beneath the order of bishop didn't have to be. So if the law says a bishop cannot be married, then it was assumed that everybody else can be, and everybody else can be sexually active.
I see.
And gradually that turned into the discipline in the East, whereas in the West it took a different turn. But I think we simply have to understand that the tradition does develop. We know that there's a continuity of tradition going back to the beginning, but that doesn't mean that it's never changed, that it's never grown, and a lot of the splits in Christianity have to do with different regional traditions that kind of diverged so far that other traditions could no longer recognize commonality in those. Like imagine you're a Latin Rite Catholic, maybe in, I don't know, the Renaissance or something, and you visit like a Coptic speaking, like Ethiopian church, it might look like another religion to you, and you might be like, is this even Christianity? How do I recognize? They have all these different ideas and beliefs, and so it's something. It's an issue with the church's universality that we're still reconciling here in human history.
I've come to the conclusion, not being a historian by any stretch of the imagination, that the Protestant Reformation nor the French Revolution was the worst, most detrimental events in Catholic Church history, but it was the 1054 schism. 1054, is that right?
Yeah, 1053, 54.
Yeah, that, because the church was split in half. You know? Do you agree with that?
I don't know. I think I've come to think that if it didn't split in 1054, it would have split at another point. Like the 1054 events just happened to be the thing that split it. I mean, I think the East and West had been out of communion, I want to say 4 or 5 times before 1054,
really?
Sometimes lasting for generations. So it seems like, I mean, you hate to say it, but like it seems like the political situation, the cultural separation of the Latin West and the Greek-speaking East had brought about a situation like I just spoke about, where the way the Latins and the Greeks spoke of each other, they didn't even really recognize a common Christianity.
Yeah.
It was kind of, and
so different.
Yeah, very, very different. I think the situation is riper now for a reconciliation than it was back then. I mean, I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime, but now we at least have there's more of a cultural awareness of like, okay, you don't do things the way I do it, but I can recognize the antiquity of this. Whereas, yeah, they just were more combative about it in those days. I think because the cultures were more insulated. Like if you see the debates between, for example, the Benedictine monks and the Irish monks over the tonsure, it's so vitriolic. Like today we would say it's just toxic, but they're like, yeah, your tonsure is the tonsure of Judas. Like you're not, you're literally wearing the sign of Christ's betrayer, and they're like saying things like this because they're shaving their head in a different way. But their cultures were so insulated where when they encounter something different, they're like, what do you mean you're monks? You don't do this. You don't shave your head like this. Like it was so very radically different.
Yeah. Have you studied much the Filioque debate?
No.
No, okay.
I'm aware of it, but I haven't studied much.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating thing. And, historically, the original creed did not say that the Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father and the Son. It didn't have "and the Son."
Yeah, that was added later.
That was added later.
Yeah.
And so I've just been looking into it a little bit more, but there's always a historical story behind these things. It's sort of like when we learned one nation under God, indivisible, and then people found out later that
it was added in 1954.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So it's one of those interesting points that needs more historical understanding to really have an informed opinion on it.
Yeah. These things can still be vitriolic today. Like I've read Filioque debates and they're very like, the people get really wound up about them.
They do, yeah.
I often get like Eastern Orthodox in my comments who will just like blast me, like they just say things and, we'll probably get comments on this video when it's posted about what I said about celibacy.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. I think in one sense we're in a better spot because of our more cultural awareness, but the same. I mean, but at the same time, we've been apart for 1,000 years now.
Yeah.
Like, is that going to get reconciled? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. You got questions?
Where's the Ark of the Covenant?
Dude.
You said Ethiopia. I just,
Yeah.
You know, that's what came to my mind.
Yeah.
I think it's in Ethiopia.
Yeah. I went down a rabbit hole on this like about 2 years ago. The Ethiopian hypothesis is very interesting.
I love it.
Very, very interesting. I read Graham Hancock's book on it, even though he's a schlocky reporter that can't really be trusted.
Dude, I watched all his documentaries. It's compelling, going all the way back to Solomon.
Yeah, it is compelling and it's interesting. There's problems with it too, but I read did you know going back to history, I was like, where did medieval people think the Ark of the Covenant was? Because medieval people didn't know about the Ethiopia tradition. Really? There's actually a very strong tradition that it's in the walls of, which church? I'm drawing a blank now. One of the 4 stational churches of Rome.
Really?
I want to say
Lateran?
Lateran.
Yeah. That's the cathedral. That's the cathedral.
Yeah. So there was a strong tradition that it was brought back from the Crusades in the 1100s, and during the Middle Ages, it was enshrined in a wall in St. John Lateran. And I tracked down, there was like a Danish guy that did his doctoral thesis on this theory, and he went through all the evidence. Now, he's not saying it was there, but he's saying that in the Middle Ages, people believed it was there. And the Jews in Rome, the Pope used to allow them once a year to come to St. John Lateran to venerate the Ark of the Covenant in the wall of the Lateran Basilica.
Wow.
So then, this is going to infuriate you, what I'm about to say next. So in the 1700s, as we're moving to the Enlightenment and people are getting more like scientific, people started casting doubt on what this box in the wall of St. John Lateran was. And the Pope at the time, I want to say it was Benedict XIV, he ordered the box taken out and put in a chapel. And then he had a bunch of his people examine the box. They measured it, everything. And then he spent the night in prayer in front of the box. And then the following day, he ordered it removed from Lateran, and there's no record of where they took it or what happened to it.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah, it's so frustrating. But it had been there since like the 1100s at some point. So it had been there for 600 years in the wall. And then he apparently thought it was fake and had it pitched at some point. So no record where it went. It might be in the basement of some building in Rome somewhere.
Yeah, you don't think he thought it was legitimate and tucked it away in the archives?
No, because I don't think everybody thought it was legitimate for the whole Middle Ages and Renaissance, and I think that they started casting doubt on it, thinking it was a forgery, and he got rid of it. But even if he got rid of it, like even if it wasn't real, like it was some box that was brought over from the Middle East during the Crusades that people thought was the Ark of the Covenant.
Still an artifact.
Yeah, and the Jews of the city even believed it was the Ark of the Covenant.
He wouldn't have just trashed it. He would have filed it away in the Vatican archives.
It might probably there somewhere.
It's down there.
If anyone wants to read about that, if you Google, I just have an article called "The Ark of the Covenant in the Lateran Basilica," I think, and if you look that up, you'll see the whole. That's one of those history things I read. That was like, you did what? Like
wow,
you just
amazing.
You just didn't
I
write
have
down.
never heard that.
Me neither.
It's actually my favorite church in Rome.
Yeah,
John
I came across it in reading a medieval text by a medieval liturgist named William of Durandus, who was writing about the medieval liturgy. This is in the 1200s, and he was like, blah, 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 blah. As everyone knows, the Ark is in the Lateran Basilica. And I was like what? And I started, and it took me to this like Danish guy's thesis, and yeah, I went down a rabbit hole on this.
So what do you think on Graham Hancock's ancient civilization theory?
I didn't read more of Graham Hancock's work after I read his book on the Ark.
Yeah, it's basically, I mean, I don't know if this is right, you know more than I do, but basically advanced civilizations prior to the flood.
Oh,
the flood just reshaped everything.
Yeah, there's a theory that the Younger Dryas period, there was a cataclysmic event, whether it was...
That we used to have advanced civilization that was completely obliterated.
Prior to what the flood... Yeah, the flood...
Yeah.
Also the flood myth, right?
Yeah.
Quotations from all the different cultures and civilizations around the world.
Don't worry, Kevin believes in the flood for those listening. Yeah.
Yes. I'm just calling myth.
He put myth in air quotes.
Yes, myth is air quotes. Flood is not. That shared by all these different civilizations because something legitimately happened, a global catastrophe.
Yeah.
And I'm not the scientist on this, but there's quite a few, including Graham Hancock, who kind of support the notion of the flood during what's called the Younger Dryas period.
And I think I think Graham Hancock also, he argues that the Sphinx is actually like 10,000 years old or something,
Yes,
that it was from a
yes.
pre-Egyptian civilization.
Yeah, I
and
think
it
the
was changed. The face has changed
Yeah, I
completely.
think the story was it was originally just a lion's head, and
Yeah,
that was
and then-
carved into the
Which is
pharaoh's
why it's
head after.
disproportionate size.
Right,
yeah.
that's why there's also water erosion all around it when there's not the same type of erosion around the pyramids necessarily.
Right, because the rain was actually different back then.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and this is getting a little off.
What we're talking
off
about
the
now,
course.
kids, is called conspiracy theories.
Yeah.
Right.
Tan Books is here to help you become a saint. That's why we do everything we do. We publish thousands of titles, literally, that are specifically written to help you get to heaven. Everything from the lives of the saints to the writings of the saints, the greatest doctors of the church, the great spiritual masters, Alphonsus Liguori, St. Francis de Sales, and so on. So please come to tanbooks.com and find the book that God wants you to have right now so that you can get to heaven and be a saint for eternity.
There's an interesting theory I'll just throw out there if you haven't heard about it yet, and it's not really conspiracy theory. It's just about Atlantis.
Yeah.
The Eye of the Sahara Desert, the
Yeah.
Rishat Circle. It's over in Western Africa, and there's quite a bit of interesting information, like geologically. Geologically, it's got the circular structure, the concentric circle structure described by Plato, and there's evidence of a major flood washing. I mean, really, if you look at like satellite photography, like major floods creating the Sahara basically, and washing away everything that was across northern Africa.
Wow.
And a large watershed, underneath the coastline, you can see large sections of the shelf washed away
that's so
underneath.
cool.
And so it's an interesting thought when you look at it from above and you look at the fact that there's salt deposits in the Rishat Circle as well. You say, okay, well, it must have been salt water that flooded across, not fresh water.
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing to look into if you want to, but it could what were we talking about just a moment ago? Oh yeah, with the Sphinx, like it could have been the same event because it looks like there was actually water flow all the way across the continent. Just amazing and difficult to believe.
See, earlier to speak to like why I'm not a historian, it's because we talk about this stuff publicly. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. If you had that PhD, you'd
If
be
I had
stopping me. Yeah.
No, I guess since I don't have the PhD, I can speculate on Atlantis and the Sahara.
Yeah.
No, dude, that's cool. I want to look into that.
Yeah. So of all the historical areas, what's your favorite?
Oh man, I don't even know anymore.
I mean, so like, what's the next work you're going to work on? If you were going to write another book published by Tan, and hopefully, but it was like of your own interest, that would sell well. It can't be too obscure. It can't be like,
Oh, he just canceled out.
yeah, it's got to be something that sells.
It's not the story of celibacy. Let's just say that.
Yeah. No.
Right, the story itself. So I mean,
I
but
don't think that's the next
is
one in
there
that
like that
series.
Ark of the Covenant thing in John Letter? That's fascinating. But is there some other kind of fascinating things that you've kind of been focused on recently and studying? Because I know you're constantly learning new things.
Yeah. I cycle through. So I methodically study. Like I cycle through different periods. Like I just read a book about like the 1848 revolutions in Europe, and so now I'm cycling back to reading more ancient history, and then I'll read something medieval or read something from a different culture. So I kind of cycle through history. It's hard for me to pick favorite times anymore, but like I've always wanted to write, like if I was writing my own book that didn't have any constraints, I would be writing. I really like ancient history, like specifically like Egypt and Babylon and that sort of stuff. And I've always, my like dream has always been to write like a nice book just about kind of that, like the pre-Greco-Roman ancient world, where the whole book, and it wasn't like a kid's book, but maybe not a scholarly book, but not like a kid's book, maybe like a popular trade level book. Because I really like what ends up happening, and I love Civilization Volume 1, but it is a textbook for kids. And what ends up happening when you try to, like, people always want the ancient world and they want to lump Egypt into the same book with like Greece and Rome and stuff. And those eras don't belong together, like structurally.
Right. They just call them all ancient.
They call them all ancient and smoosh them together. And what ends up happening is because from our Western culture, Greece and Rome is way more important to our own development. We tend to like rush through Egypt and Assyria and stuff so we can get to Greece and Rome and spend a lot of time there. And I would love to write something where I've been reading, like this year I read like this is like what Mr. Campbell does in his spare time.
Yes.
I was reading like ancient Egyptian love poetry, and I was just really struck by the similarities of the things they were expressing, in 1500 BC, where this guy's talking about like, she was the light of my days. She was this and this. 7 days ago, she left me. And I'm like, bro, and like, what if there was I would love to write a book where I could be leisurely and be like, now we're going to like look at the poetry. We're going to go through and just look at all the culture, not just like this pharaoh built this and whatever. We're going to like look at the art in detail. We're going to try to understand the mentality of these people, because this is the milieu that like human civilization evolved out of, these first people. And I really am interested by it. And I'm interested in it because it's so far removed from our own experiences and times today. It gives me a sense of permanence, to get behind. I often think about, and I'm not even joking, when I'm thinking about the turmoil in the modern world, I like to think about like ancient Egypt and like the longevity of that civilization. Like that specific civilization lasted for 3,000 years, like we talk today, like, oh, an empire is lucky if it has 200 years,
Yeah,
like,
we say that a lot, yeah.
That whole pharaonic civilization lasted for 3,000 years, and the extraordinary continuity that they had is insane, and it gives me a sense of like, kind of like the permanent things, that endure. And I think I like casting my mind back to the sunrise of human civilization when people were still figuring things out. It's very interesting.
Well, they were clearly advanced. They still don't know how the pyramids were built. These blocks are way too heavy. But one of the most fascinating things I saw was it's one of these very famous Egyptian heads.
Yeah.
And we've seen that for generations.
Yeah.
But a modern scientist looked at it and said, okay, wait a second. Something else here is incredible. It's so perfectly symmetrical. Like the distance of the tip of the nose to the ear and the length of the eyes and the length of the eyebrows and the right side of the face, Philip, is a complete perfect clone of the left side of the face.
Wow.
And so they're making this allegedly with hammer and chisel.
Yeah.
And they were saying that it's impossible to do this with, a millimeter of difference between the distance of these things, where the differences are more fine-tuned than the edge of the chisel.
Wow.
Like the chisel can't make this precision of measurement to where it's a perfect clone. So they had to have, if they said the only way that we could make this is with laser technology. Wow. That's the only way they could be that precise.
Wow.
That tells me either the assessment of that's completely wrong, or they had something other than hammers and chisels working back then. If you had to your point, if you had a civilization that was very focused and intentional about developing their skills over 3,000 years, you might come up with a completely different way of doing things. And so that precision, the size of the pyramids, what's the recent discovery where they know that something goes deep down, 1,000 feet or something into the ground beneath the pyramids?
Underneath the pyramids.
What's that all about?
Yeah, I don't have a lot of information on
I don't
that.
know much about it.
You've seen that?
No.
I think, as always, with every single time something like this comes up, there's debate about the validity of the
research,
research of the experiment. But there was some kind of sonography or something that was shooting down beneath the ground under the pyramids, and they saw huge columns. I think like cylindrical columns,
cylinders going down,
enormous, like way bigger.
Well,
than
it's the size of a skyscraper. It's like the
Yeah.
Eiffel Tower underneath the pyramids.
Right.
Wow,
way
that's
down, and like
clearly
10 of them.
man-made.
Like 10 of them though. Like
I was
separate.
I recently wrote I wrote a book for a small. There was like a co-op out east that wanted me to write a kind of like an in-house book just for their co-op, and they wanted an ancient history book, and I wrote a whole ancient history thing for them, but it was the same thing. They wanted like Rome and Greece in it and stuff, and I was like, this is the second time because I wrote this, and then I wrote like another different version for their co-op, and I was like, if I write this again, I'm going to do it the way I want entirely. There's such an interesting. It's an elegant time in human history, but also very savage at the same time. It's it encapsulates everything about humanity,
Speaking of savage, have you ever read, nice segue, I guess, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford?
Yes, I have read that.
My favorite history book.
Yeah.
I mean, besides these, of course. But what I was thinking is like his storytelling narrative of the life of Genghis Khan and his descendants is very much like yours. And I noticed that our volume 3, coincidentally, we had volume 3, The Making of the Modern World, and so I didn't know if that was accidental or not. But
I think I had that because I have that book on my shelf, and I probably thought of that title. I read that book when I was in college, and it was pretty influential on me. Now, they just celebrated, I think, the 25th year of it coming out. That book, so if anyone doesn't know, that Jack Weatherford's book on Genghis Khan, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Jack Weatherford was one of the first researchers allowed into Mongolia, because that used to be part of the Soviet Union, one of the first Westerners, and he went and did previously undone research on the Mongols, because the Soviets tried to repress history about the Mongols for fear of causing nationalist uprisings amongst modern-day Mongols. And so he wrote this book on Genghis Khan, the Mongols. Subsequently, I think a lot of other historians have have critiqued a lot of the specific things that he says, but overall, I actually have an article on Homeschool Connections blog where I say it was one of the most influential history books I ever read in terms of making me love history.
For me too.
Yeah, what a great written book.
Have you thought about writing more extensively on Eastern empires and dynasties?
Yeah, well, I have a book from ARCS called God. It's the history of the Philippines, God's Rampart in Asia. So it's like a whole history of the Philippines. I would love to write a book on like the history of Japan, China. Like I'd love all these things, but it's like there's only so much time, and it's like there has to be the demand for it as well. Mm-hmm. So, but I constantly get asked. People will read Civilization and they will email me and be like, "Do you have something on China, or do you have something on the East?" And I'm like,
we made the intentional decision to kind of
leave that out.
I mean, you can't do everything.
Yeah, you can't fit it all in. It would need a standalone book, and then it would be like, do enough people buy it to justify
That's
the
really
time?
Not part of our Western tradition. I mean, it's pretty well.
But I'd still like to write it. I mean, I wrote a whole history book on Ireland recently called The Saga of Ireland. I love the like regional specific narratives because you can get into that stuff like the culture and the literature and all that. But yeah,
what time period for Ireland?
I wrote the whole history from ancient times.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I'll send you a copy.
Yeah. Who's that with?
I did it myself. Yeah, I crowdfunded it. Yeah.
Oh, really?
I went to like my followers and said, if I can raise $5,000 to pay for this, and I hired Chris Lewis from Veritas to do all the illustrations. It was a big it took me 22 months, but I crowdfunded it and published it myself. And it's being used in Irish schools right now. Like Irish Catholic homeschoolers use this book.
When did you do that?
It came out last spring.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think Ireland had like one ordination last year, the whole country.
Goodness.
Yeah, the faith's basically dead there.
Yeah, that's sad.
Which means it will be rebirthed somehow. I mean, that's the thing. These things kind of go away, and then it'll come back stronger than it has been in a long time.
Yeah.
Back to Egypt.
Oh, yeah.
If you studied that, have you paid any attention to the history of how the Jewish people kind of merged with that? I mean, there's debates about whether they were actually quote unquote slaves or.
Yeah, I've read all of that, but like I just don't know what to think of it.
Right.
So I'm not going to comment on it, but I have read all the Exodus related history and whatnot.
It's fascinating.
It is very fascinating. They've like the place where Goshen was, like I can't remember who said this, but they said like ethnically this is like it's Semitic. It's like a Semitic area, like because they found the all throughout Goshen they have the traditional Jewish. It's called a 4-room house, which is like a traditional layout that that Jews and other Semitic groups build their house, like a little house with 4 rooms, one for like the livestock, one to live in, whatever. So wherever you find the 4-room house, that's like evidence that there was Jews or Semitic peoples like Amorites or whatever living there, and that's all throughout Goshen around the capital of Avaris, I think is what it's called. But yeah, it's very interesting. I want to just do more study on that. It's such a cool time.
There's a great documentary on how the Hebrew written language may have developed.
Yeah,
and you can see. I think they call it Hebrew, and before they have Proto-Hebrew.
Yeah.
And then you have hieroglyphics.
Yeah.
And in fact, I don't know if we can pull it up. I guess we can't. But there's great forms where you see the hieroglyphic image, a picture of something.
The Hebrew coming from the hieroglyphic.
Yes.
Yeah.
And one scholar was speculating that Moses, who is said to have written the Pentateuch, right, may have, he was educated in the hieroglyphics, and he may have actually helped to create that Proto-Hebrew language by like taking the hieroglyphs. Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
I don't know how good this is, but and we can show it on the screen.
Here's just an example. Well, this is not enough. Go to this one. Go to this one here. Okay, so let's take this for example. So here you got this cow-looking creature, right?
Yeah.
And so the hieroglyphic is a cow, and the sound is k, like K, right? And over time, the cow's head ends up modifying, and then it shifts. In Paleo-Hebrew, it shifts sideways, and you can see the A, which even influences our modern A, because Paleo-Hebrew went to Greek, and it becomes English. And you have many other examples. This was a great one here. This guy standing with his arms up like a football goal. Yeah, it's high, and it's for praise. Yeah, but their word was halal. Yeah, and then so the that sound for Egyptians was, like the guy standing there like a football goal. And over time, that became an H. You can see the H coming from that. Yeah.
The H is literally a man with his hands up.
Yeah, this is a good one. This is a good one. So that little wavy line down here, the sound was or no, was the sound M?
And it says N, but then it says M here.
Yeah,
so
mayhem, which is water. And their word for water was mayhem, and it became an M. Yeah. The wavy line shifted. Nehas was snake. They drew a snake, and it became N as an N. I mean, the snake shape became an N, and you can see you twist the shape of the snake a little bit, and it becomes an N. It's over and over and over again. It's just amazing how hieroglyphics became Proto-Hebrew, became Hebrew, which influenced Greek, which influenced English. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, and it shows you how the English letters used to be pictographic. You can see I think it's just cool that the word for human is a man like holding his hands up to praise the divinity. Like, that's so cool.
It's so cool. So anyway, I just found that to be kind of a fascinating thing but this documentary was making the argument that somebody would have had to have, like, if you have the Jewish people had just left enslavement, right? Yeah. And one of the things that they needed to be able to do. Remember, they didn't have any written text yet of the Torah. You know, if that civilization, which had been enslaved for a long time, if they were going to develop their own national identity with their own sanitation laws and all the food laws, all these things that Moses was helping them develop their own standalone culture, completely freed from this pagan civilization. One of the most important things for them would be their own language.
Yeah, exactly.
They needed their own language. They couldn't write the story of Adam in hieroglyphics. They needed their own. That was a pagan language. Yeah. And so the thesis is that Moses would have helped shape this from hieroglyphics to something else, and that Proto-Hebrew could have been the thing he developed.
Wow.
Because the very earliest text of Old Testament writings is not what we think of as Hebrew. It's something prior to that.
Yeah, exactly.
I just love that premise. Like, when we hear that Moses wrote the Old Testament, he might have actually written the language that the Old Testament was written in as well.
They just discovered some Proto-Hebrew writings on Mount Ebal in Israel. Have you heard about this?
No.
So this is like the mountain where at the Exodus they put the Israelites on two mountains, and they had them say blessings and cursings to each other, like the curses of the law. And on Mount Ebal, they found these Proto-Hebrew tablets that have cursings on them. Like when they decoded it, translated, it said like, "May you be cursed by Yahweh, curse you," and it's like all these curses.
Let them be anathema. We did that at Council of Trent.
Exactly. It's so cool. It's so neat. I'm going to put this in the realm of conspiracy theory, but like, you should look up. There's people that try to argue that ancient Hebrew influenced the development of Chinese, and they make the same sort of connections.
Really?
I think it's inconclusive, but you can't deny that there's some interesting parallels between that. So if you're interested in this sort of stuff, there's a lot of stuff out there on Hebrew and Chinese.
Well, kind of what came to mind when you said that is, I think it's one of Plato's dialogues, he makes a reference to before the philosophers there were the prophets.
Yeah.
And I've wondered, okay, I mean, it's very
Who's
clear
he
to me.
referring to?
Plato was a monotheist. I mean, he believed in the deities, kind of like I think the way we believe in angels or something, you know, but I believe he believed in, well, I know he believed in the one, okay? But, you know, that little phrase makes me wonder if Judaism somehow made its way over to the pre-Socratics in Greece and influenced them, and then by just being introduced the idea of a one all-powerful God, that kind of was the seed that set the
if like Judaism was responsible for the birth of philosophy.
Yes, well, at least the birth of I guess you call it natural philosophy, to where they concluded rationally that there was one God.
Yeah.
I just love that idea, but what does it mean? Just before the philosophers, there were the prophets.
Yeah.
And so I think that could be. I mean, why not? I mean, people were traveling the world, and they could have easily come in contact with this notion of monotheism.
Yeah, and there was a Jewish diaspora after the fall of the Northern Kingdom, you know, in 722, that would have correlated with the kind of like latter Greek Dark Ages where that could have happened.
Now, was Moses, since we're on this is totally random, but it's just the whole conversation is random, but that's good, you know. But was Moses a monotheist, or was Abraham a monotheist? Go all the way back to Abraham, because it's like, did they believe in one God, or there were many gods and one supreme above the others, which is different. I forget the term.
Yeah, there's a word for that. I
forget the word for it, but you know,
I don't know. I mean,
because I think first, like, Abraham may not have actually believed in only one God. He may believe that there was many gods, but one was supreme.
Yeah.
It's different. That's different.
Well, there's a tradition about Abraham's family living in Ur, was that Abraham's father was an idol maker or something like that.
Yeah.
Right? And then God revealed himself to Abraham, and Abraham repudiated idols or something like that. But I don't know if he believed that those gods were real.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. There is a word that, and I believe hearing and reading in the past.
Yeah,
that,
I can't remember
the very first, the founding fathers of Judaism were not necessarily
strictly
monotheistic, you know, but this, I mean, I'm sure Adam was.
Yeah.
But with sin entering into the world, I would think Noah was.
Yeah.
But, you know, over time, it could have been watered down but rose back up.
Yeah.
With
Did you find it, Kevin?
Henotheism?
That's it.
Could be, yeah.
Henotheism, yeah.
Greek henos for one, theos for God, but one God is supreme among many.
Yeah.
Well, you know, in terms of wrapping up, what are your future plans for history? You know, I mean, we've done so much work. You've been such a tremendous teacher to all these students, homeschoolers all over. As a vocation, though, as a historian, as a writer, as a teacher, where do you see yourself in 5-10 years? I mean, what do you want to keep working on?
Yeah, I like doing the textbook stuff. I really need breaks between them, you know, so I think in my life, I'll probably do a couple more books. We were actually talking with Jason about that before we came into the office, but you know, so I think there will be some more textbooks in the future, but like in terms of like my normal writing, I really like telling the stories of, lately I've really been liking telling the stories of the saints, and especially like how, we've got Padre Pio and Genevieve here.
I forgot to mention these two.
I should mention here.
Yeah, please mention them both, yeah.
Yeah, so we've got the story of Wounds of Love, the story of St. Padre Pio, and Matron of Paris, the story of St. Genevieve. I will say this actually is my favorite book I've ever written.
Are you serious?
Yeah. Because St. Genevieve, there was enough known about her that I had an outline for her life, but enough was unknown that I had to fill in a lot of gaps with my own like narrative. And I poured so much of like my own thought and spirituality and personal struggle into this story. So when you read Matron of Paris, like you're reading like my own spiritual like kind of wrestling and my own spiritual life, and it means a lot to me.
Wow.
So
I'm so glad you said that.
Yeah, this book is probably my favorite one I've ever written. But I really love this model of using the lives of the saints as templates to illustrate like spiritual truths. I think what people really want to hear these days is not just learn the history. I mean, that's step one, but they want to read the church's history, the lives of the saints, and be affected by it and be like this. Because so much in our lives today is ephemeral. So much of there's a sense of like a general like kind of sense of collapse in society. People are looking for things that they can like dig into that will anchor them as people, you know, better their human existence. And I want to use these stories to give people like kind of like real like spiritual meat that they can chew on, that will be like, yes, through reading the story of Padre Pio, I've really gotten something about my faith that I can, you know, really live by. And so I'm hoping to do more of that sort of thing.
Well, you should be the new Louis DeWall. You know, I mean, that my wife has read probably 20 of his books.
That was kind of the idea behind doing some of these,
Yeah.
and I'm hoping that we'll get back to more stuff like this.
Me too.
But yeah, I promote this book everywhere. It's just Genevieve is not as well known as like some of the other saints, but like I put so much of myself into this book, and I just love everything about it. It is my favorite thing I've written.
Well,
so
I'm
far.
going to France this summer with some of my kids and my wife, so I got to read that before we get there.
Please do.
Matron of Paris.
Let me
for
know
sure.
what you think.
I will, man. I
Yeah.
will.
Yeah, so that's about it.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Anything else? Thanks for being here, man.
Yeah, this was cool.
This has been a real pleasure.
Yeah,
There's
it's
so
been a
much.
few years. I'm glad to hook up with you guys again.
Yeah, you've done tremendous work. Thanks for everything you've done. Let's find some more things to work on. Keep going, buddy.
Amen.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Good to see you.
Yeah, you too.
Hey, thanks guys for checking out the Conor Gallagher Show. Please take a moment to like, subscribe, or comment, or whatever you got to do to support it. And I appreciate that very much.